Imagine a hillside at dawn. The air is cool and thick with moisture, the specific quality of tropical air at altitude before the heat of the day builds. The valleys below are filled with mist, white and dense, moving slowly in the early light. The volcanic peaks of the Sundanese highlands rise above the mist line in every direction, dark green and enormous, their slopes terraced with tea plantations and rice paddies, and the small villages of the people who have lived in this landscape for as long as memory reaches. You are climbing. The path is steep and the stones underfoot are old, very old, irregular columnar basalt, dark grey, fitted together in a dry stone construction that rises in terraces up the side of the hill. The stones are not natural. They have been shaped or selected or arranged. They form walls and platforms and pavements that carry you upward through the vegetation, through the figs and the mosses, and the tree ferns that have grown in the cracks between the stones over decades and centuries. At the top, in the early light, you stand on the highest terrace and look out over the valley. The mist is below you. The peaks are around you. The stones of the terrace are beneath your feet, arranged in a pattern that suggests a purpose, a ceremonial space, a place of gathering, a site that was considered significant by the people who built it. The site is called Gunung Padang. In the Sundanese language, the words mean Hill of Enlightenment. It sits in Cianjur Regency in West Java, Indonesia, about 2 hours south of Jakarta by road. For most of its modern history, Gunung Padang was understood as a megalithic ceremonial site of the Sundanese people, the pre-Hindu and pre-Islamic indigenous culture of West Java. The stone terraces were thought to be a few thousand years old at most, consistent with the megalithic traditions that existed across Southeast Asia in the late prehistoric and early historic period. Then, in the 2000s, a team of Indonesian researchers began drilling beneath the surface terraces. What they found in the subsurface layers, what the core samples and the carbon dates and the geophysical surveys revealed, was something that no one on the team had expected. The structure they were standing on was not a few thousand years old. According to their analysis, the deepest layers of the buried structure had been built more than 20,000 years ago. Not more than 2,000, not more than 5,000, more than 20,000. At the height of the last glacial maximum, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, and human beings everywhere on Earth were living as hunter-gatherers. Someone, according to this analysis, was constructing a megalithic structure on a volcanic hill in West Java. My name is Arthur, and tonight we are going to sit with one of the most extraordinary and most contested claims in the recent history of archaeology. Before we go further, hello to whoever is listening right now. I don't know what time it is where you are. I don't know whether you've been here from the beginning of this series or whether tonight is your first time. Either way, welcome. If you want more videos like this, please click subscribe to show your support. A great deal of effort goes into making these videos, and simply subscribing genuinely makes a difference in keeping this channel going. And leave a comment if you feel moved to tell me where you are and what time it is now. Let me tell you what is actually claimed about Gunung Padang, and then let me tell you why the scholarly world is deeply divided about whether to believe it. The claim, at its most precise, is this. A team of Indonesian researchers led by a geologist named Danny Hilman Natawijaja published a paper in 2023 in the journal Nature, arguing that Gunung Padang is not a natural hill with a megalithic structure on top of it. It is, they argue, an artificial structure. A multi-phase construction built in successive layers over a period stretching from approximately 25,000 BCE to approximately 500 CE. The deepest layers, buried under 10 or more meters of soil and later construction, contain carbon-dated organic material that they argue was incorporated into the construction at the time of building. If this is correct, Gunung Padang is the oldest large-scale constructed structure on Earth by an enormous margin. The previous record holder was Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to approximately 10,000 BCE. Gunung Padang's proposed earliest construction date is 15,000 years older than that. The claim was immediately controversial. The paper attracted rapid and extensive criticism from archaeologists and geologists worldwide. Critics argued that the carbon dating was being misinterpreted, that the organic material in the subsurface cores was naturally deposited soil rather than evidence of human construction, and that the geophysical surveys had been over-interpreted to support a conclusion that the physical evidence did not justify. Within months of publication, Nature had published an editorial expression of concern about the paper. By early 2024, the paper had been retracted. So the story of Gunung Padang is the story of a remarkable claim, a fierce scientific debate, and a retraction. But it is also the story of a site that is genuinely unusual, that raises real questions about the deep prehistory of Southeast Asia, and that deserves more careful attention than either its most enthusiastic advocates or its most dismissive critics have given it. The retraction does not mean the site is uninteresting. It means that the specific claims made in the 2023 paper were not adequately supported by the evidence as the paper presented it. Whether the underlying evidence properly analysed might still support a more modest version of the extraordinary claim is a question that the retraction has not definitively answered. These are the questions we are going to explore tonight, not to vindicate the retracted paper, not to dismiss the site as unimportant, but to understand what is actually known about Gunung Padang, what the evidence can and cannot support, and why a hill in West Java has become the centre of one of the most intense debates in contemporary archaeology. The mist is still in the valleys. The stones are still there. The question is still open. Let me spend more time establishing why the Gunung Padang claim is so extraordinary. Not just extraordinary in the sense of being surprising, but extraordinary in the specific technical sense of requiring a fundamental revision of our understanding of the deep human past. 20,000 years ago, the world was a different place in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from the vantage point of the present. The last glacial maximum, the period of maximum ice sheet extent in the most recent ice age, was at or near its peak. Ice sheets more than 3 kilometers thick covered most of northern North America and northern Europe. Sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today because an enormous amount of water was locked up in continental ice. The coastlines of every continent looked different from how they look now. Large areas of what is now shallow sea, the Sahel Shelf connecting Australia to New Guinea, the Sunda Shelf connecting the islands of Southeast Asia to the mainland, were dry land. The climate was colder and drier than today across most of the world. The Sahara was not a wet savanna, as it would become during the African humid period. It was even drier than it is today. The tropical forests of Southeast Asia were contracted and fragmented. The landscape of West Java, where Gunung Padang sits, was different from its present form, cooler, drier, less densely vegetated. And the human population of the world was small and dispersed. Estimates vary, but the total human population 20,000 years ago was probably in the range of 1 to 3 million people, globally. Not 1 to 3 million in Indonesia, or in Southeast Asia, or in West Java. 1 to 3 million across the entire planet, a number smaller than the current population of a single major city. These people were living as hunter-gatherers, not in the pejorative sense of that term, not as primitive opportunists incapable of complex thought or organized behavior, but in the specific technical sense that their subsistence was based on hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, without the domesticated crops and animals that agriculture later provided. They were mobile, moving through their landscapes in response to the seasonal availability of food. They did not live in permanent settlements. The conventional understanding of human prehistory holds that it was not until approximately 10,000 years ago, with the emergence of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and in China and in Mesoamerica, that human societies developed the specific capabilities required for monumental construction. The surplus food production of agriculture allowed some members of a community to specialize in activities other than food production. Specialization allowed the development of craft skills, including the skills of quarrying and shaping and arranging large stones. The sedentary settlements of agricultural communities created the organizational structures, the chiefs, the priests, the labor management systems that could coordinate the sustained collective effort that building requires. Before agriculture, in the conventional model, none of this was possible at scale. Hunter-gatherers built shelters and made tools and created art, but they did not build monuments. Göbekli Tepe, as we discussed in the previous video, challenged this model by demonstrating that monumental construction was possible for pre-agricultural societies, at least at the specific date and place of that site. But Göbekli Tepe is dated to approximately 10,000 BCE. The gap between Göbekli Tepe and the proposed 25,000-year date for the deepest layers of Gunung Padang is 15,000 years. 15,000 years is not a small gap. It is longer than the entire span of recorded human history. It is longer than the time from Göbekli Tepe to the present day. A construction date of 25,000 BCE would not just extend the frontier of known monumental construction, it would shatter it. That is why the claim is extraordinary. And that is why the scrutiny it attracted from the scholarly community was so intense. The history of extraordinary claims in archaeology is not uniformly encouraging. For every genuine revision of the conventional timeline, every Göbekli Tepe that turns out to be real, there are many more claims that fail under scrutiny. The specific temptation of wanting to find evidence of a lost civilization or an impossibly ancient culture has led well-intentioned and sometimes credentialed researchers to over-interpret ambiguous evidence. The Gunung Padang case has to be understood in this context. The claim is extraordinary, the scrutiny is justified, the retraction is significant, and the question of what, beneath the rhetoric on both sides of the debate, the physical evidence at the site actually shows. That question remains genuinely interesting. Tonight, we are going to try to find that question in the cool dawn air on the volcanic hillside, with the mist still in the valleys below. Let me also say something about the specific geography of the site, because the location of Gunung Padang is itself part of what makes it interesting. Part of why, if something remarkable happened there, it might have left traces in the landscape. West Java is one of the most volcanically active regions in the world. The Indonesian archipelago sits on the Ring of Fire, the belt of tectonic subduction zones and volcanic chains that encircles the Pacific Ocean. Java alone has more than 100 volcanoes, many of them active. The landscape of West Java is defined by volcanic peaks and volcanic soils, and the specific fertility that comes from millennia of volcanic ash enriching the ground. Gunung Padang is not itself a volcano. It is a hill, a relatively modest elevation that rises above the surrounding landscape of rice paddies and tea plantations. But it is made of columnar basalt, a rock that forms when flowing lava cools rapidly, contracting into the characteristic hexagonal columns that you find in basaltic formations around the world, from the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland to the columnar basalt plateaus of the American Northwest. The columnar basalt at Gunung Padang did not flow there from a nearby eruption. It is intrusive. It was formed underground, pushed up into the existing rock by ancient volcanic activity, and then exposed by millions of years of erosion. The specific columns found at the site are therefore naturally occurring geological features of the hill itself, not material that was transported from elsewhere. This matters for understanding the site. The builders of the stone terraces at Gunung Padang did not bring their building material from a distant quarry. They worked with the material that was literally at their feet. The columnar basalt of the hill itself, which fractures naturally into roughly regular column shapes that are well suited to dry stone construction. The site is, in a specific sense, made of itself. This is actually a common feature of ancient megalithic sites. Stonehenge's blue stones came from Wales, but the larger sarsen stones came from the Marlborough Downs, 25 kilometers away. The builders of Göbekli Tepe quarried the limestone of the hill on which they built. Ancient builders consistently used what was available locally when possible, reserving the enormous effort of long-distance transport for material that was not locally available. The columnar basalt of Gunung Padang is locally available in abundance. If someone wanted to build a stone structure on this hill, they had everything they needed underfoot. The geological context supports the possibility of ancient construction in the most basic sense. The material was there. Whether the material was used for construction 25,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, is exactly what the dispute is about. And the specific chemistry and physics and stratigraphy of the site are the tools that might, if applied carefully enough, resolve it. The stones are waiting for that analysis. They have been waiting for a long time. Let me describe Gunung Padang properly. The site sits at an elevation of approximately 885 meters above sea level, on a hill in the Cianjur Regency of West Java. The hill itself is roughly oval in plan, rising about 30 meters above the surrounding landscape. To reach the main site from the base of the hill, visitors climb a stone staircase of approximately 400 steps. A steep, demanding ascent through vegetation that closes in from both sides. The ascent is part of the experience. Local guides will tell you that Gunung Padang has been a place of spiritual significance for the Sundanese people, for as long as collective memory reaches. The effort of the climb is part of the approach to a sacred site, the physical preparation for arrival. At the top, the site is organized into 5 distinct terraces, each stepping up from the one below, and connected by stone pathways and staircases. The terraces are large. The total area of the megalithic site is approximately 9,000 square meters, making it one of the largest megalithic sites in Southeast Asia. For comparison, Stonehenge encompasses roughly 100,000 square meters of its surrounding landscape, but the stone circle itself is much smaller than the total extent of Gunung Padang. The building material is columnar basalt, the same grey-black volcanic rock that forms the geological substrate of the hill itself. The columns range from small pieces a few tens of centimeters long to larger pieces over a meter in length. They are roughly rectangular in cross-section, a natural consequence of the way basalt fractures along its columnar jointing planes. And they have been arranged in dry stone walls, pavements and platforms without the use of mortar. Dry stone construction using naturally occurring columnar basalt is characteristic of Indonesian megalithic traditions across a wide geographic range. Similar techniques appear at sites in Sumatra, Sulawesi, and the Lesser Sunda Islands, as well as at sites on the Southeast Asian mainland. The specific tradition of which Gunung Padang is part is not unique to this one site. It is the regional tradition of a culture that built in stone across a large area of the archipelago. The upper terraces of Gunung Padang are the most elaborate and the most clearly anthropogenic, the most obviously the result of deliberate human construction rather than natural geological processes. The top terrace is paved with basalt columns laid flat, creating a relatively level surface approximately 20 meters across. It is surrounded by standing stones and low walls of stacked basalt columns. The effect is of a carefully planned ceremonial space, a place designed for gathering, for ritual, for the specific activities that require a flat, defined, elevated space. Visitors to the site today encounter something that feels simultaneously ancient and active. The Sundanese people regard Gunung Padang as a keramat, a sacred place, and it continues to be used as a site of meditation and pilgrimage. On auspicious days in the Javanese and Sundanese calendar, groups of pilgrims make the climb to the upper terraces to pray and meditate. Offerings of flowers and incense are left at specific points on the terraces. The living spiritual practice at the site is important context for understanding the research controversy that would later develop around it. Gunung Padang is not a dead archaeological site, a place that was once significant and is now merely an object of study. It is a living, sacred site, continuously used, continuously maintained in the consciousness of the people who live around it. This has implications for the archaeological investigation of the site. When you excavate a living sacred site, you are not just studying the past, you are intervening in an ongoing practice that has meaning for living people. The relationship between the researchers who want to drill and sample and date and the communities who regard the site as sacred is one of the less discussed dimensions of the Gunung Padang controversy. The Indonesian government formally recognized Gunung Padang as a National Cultural Heritage Site in 1998, a designation that provides it with legal protections against development and certain kinds of destructive investigation. The site is managed by the Indonesian Ministry of Education and Culture through its Directorate General of Culture. Importantly, official recognition as a cultural heritage site does not mean official endorsement of any specific theory about the site's age or origin. The heritage designation is based on the site's significance to Sundanese culture and its status as one of the largest megalithic sites in Indonesia, not on any claim about its deep history. The Indonesian government's position on the extraordinary dating claims has been complex and has shifted over time, as we will explore in the parts of tonight's journey that focus on the controversy. Now let me describe the physical context of the site more precisely, because the relationship between the visible megalithic structure and the underlying geology is central to the entire debate. The hill on which Gunung Padang stands is not a simple geological object. The core of the hill is intrusive basalt, the same material as the building stones that was pushed up into the overlying rock by ancient volcanic activity. Around and over this basalt core, successive layers of volcanic soil and weathered rock have accumulated over geological time. The present surface of the hill, including the terraces, sits on top of these accumulated layers. What the research team led by Danny Hillman Natawijaya found when they began investigating the subsurface geology was that the hill has a more complex internal structure than the simple model of a natural hill with a surface megalithic site would predict. The geophysical surveys, using ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and electrical resistivity imaging, suggested the presence of void spaces and anomalous material densities beneath the surface terraces, at depths of up to 15 meters. Void spaces and anomalous densities can have natural geological explanations. Lava tubes, differential weathering, the specific way that columnar basalt weathers and fractures underground. but they can also be evidence of subsurface construction, of walls and chambers and architectural features that have been buried under later accumulation. The interpretation of these geophysical anomalies as evidence of subsurface construction was the first major claim of the research team. It was also the first major point of contention with critics. The geophysical evidence for a subsurface structure is genuinely suggestive. Multiple independent survey techniques pointed to the same general location of anomalies. The pattern of the anomalies was difficult to explain by reference to the known geology of the hill alone. But suggestive is not the same as conclusive. Geophysical anomalies require ground truthing, physical sampling, and inspection of the actual material before they can be confidently interpreted as evidence of construction. The ground truthing at Gunung Padang through a series of core drillings and small trenches is where the most contentious evidence was collected and where the most serious methodological disputes arose. We will explore those disputes in detail in the parts that follow. For now, let me leave you with the image of the site as it appears on the surface. The 5 terraces, the columnar basalt, the offerings of flowers, the mist in the valleys, the volcanic peaks on the horizon. Whatever the subsurface holds, the surface is real. The stones were placed by human hands. The question is only when. Let me place Gunung Padang within the broader context of Indonesian and Southeast Asian prehistory, because the site does not exist in isolation. It belongs to a tradition of megalithic construction that spans an enormous geographic range and a deep chronological depth. An understanding that tradition helps us understand what kind of claim is actually being made about Gunung Padang. The megalithic tradition of Southeast Asia is one of the oldest and most geographically extensive in the world. The term megalithic refers broadly to the construction of monuments using large undressed or roughly dressed stones. Standing stones, stone circles, stone terraces, dolmens and related forms. Megalithic traditions existed across Europe, the Middle East, South Asia and Southeast Asia, with considerable regional variation in the specific forms and functions of the monuments. In Indonesia, the megalithic tradition includes some of the most impressive and least studied sites in the world. The stone statues of Sulawesi, some of them 3 meters tall and depicting human figures with elaborate headdresses, date to perhaps 3,000 years ago and represent a sophisticated sculptural tradition whose cultural context is still poorly understood. The stone sarcophagi of the Batak people in northern Sumatra, elaborately carved and still used in ceremonial contexts today, represent a living connection to the megalithic past. The stone seats and stone altars and stone platforms of Nias Island in the Indian Ocean, some of them very large and still the focus of ritual activity, demonstrate the continuity of the megalithic tradition into the present. Within this tradition, Gunung Padang is unusual primarily in its scale and in its claim to antiquity. The surface terraces are consistent with Indonesian megalithic construction of the last few thousand years. The specific techniques and materials are recognizable within the regional tradition. What the research team led by Nata Wijaya was claiming was not that the surface terraces were unusual, but that beneath them lay something much older. The specific claim about the subsurface layers requires understanding what the drilling and the geophysical surveys actually found, and we will explore that in detail in subsequent parts of tonight's journey. But first, let me say something about the specific quality of the terrain and the landscape that makes Gunung Padang the kind of place that attracts human attention and human meaning-making across long periods of time. Elevated sites with commanding views have been places of significance for human cultures across the world and across time. There is something specific about the experience of altitude, the expanded visual range, the sense of being above the ordinary landscape, the specific quality of light and air at elevation, that appears to make high places spiritually and ritually significant in a wide range of cultural traditions. Gunung Padang has this quality. The view from the upper terrace on a clear day encompasses an enormous sweep of the West Javan landscape. Volcanic peaks in every direction, the patchwork of rice terraces and tea gardens in the valleys, the distant shimmer of the Java Sea on clear days. It is a place that feels significant even to people with no prior knowledge of its history or its cultural importance. If this place has been considered sacred by the people of West Java for a very long time, if the spiritual significance that attaches to it today is the continuation of a much older tradition, then the possibility that it was a focus of human attention and perhaps human construction much earlier than the visible surface structures suggest is not implausible on general grounds. Sacred places tend to be sacred across long periods. The specific spot that one generation regards as spiritually significant tends to be the same spot that the next generation regards as significant. The specific combination of topography, orientation, and the accumulated weight of previous human attention, creating a self-reinforcing pattern of significance across time. This is speculative as applied to any particular site, but as a general principle it is well supported by the archaeology of sacred sites across the world. The great cathedral at Chartres was built on a site that had been sacred to the Druids. The Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem is built on the Temple Mount, which was sacred to the Israelites, which was sacred to the Canaanites before them. Sacred sites persist. If Gunung Padang has been a sacred site for a very long time, if the spiritual tradition that surrounds it today is the visible surface of a much deeper history, then the question of how long that history extends is genuinely interesting. Not for the sensational reason that an ancient structure would vindicate some lost civilization narrative, but for the more fundamental reason that understanding when and why places become sacred, and how that sacredness persists across cultural change and population movement and the passage of millennia, is one of the most important questions in the archaeology of human belief. The stones of Gunung Padang are part of that question, however old they turn out to be. Let me also describe the specific experience of the lower terraces of Gunung Padang, because the upper terrace gets most of the attention in popular accounts, but the lower terraces tell a different story, one that is relevant to understanding how the site evolved over time. The lower terraces are less finished than the upper ones. The stone arrangements are more irregular, the walls less precisely aligned, the overall impression more of an accumulation than a deliberate design. This is consistent with either of two interpretations. It could reflect the natural variation in construction quality that you find in any large human project, some areas receiving more attention than others, some builders being more skilled than others. Or it could reflect the multi-phase construction that the research team proposed, the lower terraces being later additions built over an earlier, simpler structure. The specific pattern of the site, more elaborate at the top, less elaborate as you descend, is unusual for megalithic sites that were built in a single period. Typically, the most elaborate parts of a site are those most accessible to the builders and most visible to observers. A site built from the bottom up would normally show greater elaboration at the lower levels, where the foundations are laid with care, and decreasing precision toward the top, where the work is less visible. Gunung Padang inverts this pattern. The most elaborate construction is at the top. The less elaborate construction is lower down and would have been built over if the conventional bottom-up model applied. This inversion is one of the genuine puzzles of the site, one that the multi-phase construction model addresses by proposing that the summit was the original focus of activity and that the lower terraces were added in later periods, building outward and downward from the original sacred summit. The multi-phase model is not in itself controversial. Many ancient sacred sites show evidence of multiple phases of construction and modification. What is controversial is the specific dates proposed for each phase, and in particular, the proposed date of the earliest phase. But before we can evaluate the dates, we need to understand how those dates were obtained. That requires turning to the geology, to the drilling and the carbon dating that produced the extraordinary numbers that made headlines around the world, and to Danny Hillman Natawijaja. Let me tell you what mainstream archaeology says about Gunung Padang. Before Danny Hillman Natawijaja began his investigations, before the core drilling and the carbon dates and the 2023 Nature paper, Gunung Padang was understood in a specific and relatively uncontroversial way within Indonesian archaeology. It was a significant site, large, well-preserved, culturally important, but not an anomaly. It fit within the conventional understanding into the known pattern of megalithic construction in prehistoric and early historic Indonesia. The conventional dating of the visible surface terraces places their construction somewhere in the range of roughly 500 BCE to 1500 CE, a span of about 2,000 years that encompasses the late prehistoric through the early historic period in West Java. The specific dates for different parts of the surface structure vary, and the conventional dating is itself not perfectly resolved. But the general picture is of a site that was constructed and used across several centuries, with the most elaborate terraces dating to roughly the first millennium CE. This dating places Gunung Padang in the period of the Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms that dominated much of Java and Sumatra from approximately the 5th to the 15th centuries CE. The Sundanese kingdom of Pajajaran, which was the dominant political entity in West Java from the 13th to the 16th centuries, controlled the region where Gunung Padang is located, and the site may have been significant within the religious landscape of that kingdom. The specific Sundanese tradition around Gunung Padang is rich and detailed. Local accounts describe the site as connected to the legendary figure of Prabu Siliwangi, the most celebrated of the Pajajaran kings, who ruled in the 15th century and who is a central figure in Sundanese oral tradition. Stories about Prabu Siliwangi and Gunung Padang are still told in the communities around the site. The king is said to have been associated with the site in various ways. Some traditions say he built part of it. Others say he performed rituals there. Others say the site was already ancient even in his time. These oral traditions are valuable as evidence of the site's cultural significance within Sundanese society, but they are not reliable as evidence of the site's construction date. Oral traditions have a well-documented tendency to attach famous names to significant sites, regardless of whether those famous figures actually had any connection to the site. The association with Prabu Siliwangi probably reflects the site's importance within the Sundanese cultural landscape, rather than a genuine historical connection to the 15th century king. The mainstream archaeological position on Gunung Padang before the Natawijaja controversy was essentially that of any large Indonesian megalithic site. Interesting, culturally significant, worthy of preservation and study, but not extraordinary in its basic character. The stone terraces were consistent with the regional megalithic tradition. The dating was consistent with the conventional chronology of Indonesian prehistory, and the site raised no questions that the existing framework of Indonesian archaeology could not accommodate. The Indonesian government's investment in the site as a heritage destination in the late 20th and early 21st centuries reflects this conventional understanding. The site was developed for tourism with a visitor centre, improved pathways, and interpretive signage. The interpretation offered to visitors positioned Gunung Padang as a window into the prehistoric and early historic cultures of West Java. A significant but not extraordinary monument to the people who built it. This is the baseline from which the Natawijaya research departed. Understanding the baseline is important for understanding the controversy that followed. The researchers who undertook the core drilling and the geophysical surveys were not working in a vacuum. They were operating within the context of an established archaeological understanding of the site. When their results suggested something dramatically different from that understanding, the magnitude of the departure was not just scientific but institutional. They were not merely proposing a revised date for a site whose date was uncertain. They were proposing a date that contradicted the entire framework within which Indonesian megalithic sites had been understood. Let me now describe in more detail what the conventional archaeology of the visible terraces actually shows, because this matters for understanding what the drilling found, and why the interpretation of what the drilling found was so contested. The surface terraces of Gunung Padang have been subject to conventional archaeological investigation. Surface survey, stratigraphic analysis of exposed sections, pottery analysis, and limited excavation. The results of these investigations are largely consistent with the conventional dating range of 500 BCE to 1500 CE. The pottery found at the site includes types characteristic of the late prehistoric and early historic period in West Java. The specific forms, the clay bodies, the surface treatments, the vessel shapes, are consistent with what is found at other sites of similar date in the region. This is significant because pottery is one of the most reliable dating tools available to archaeologists. The forms and technologies of pottery change over time in well-characterized ways, and the pottery at a site provides a rough date range for the occupation of that site. The pottery at Gunung Padang says, this site was used in the 1st millennium CE, and possibly somewhat earlier. It does not say, this site was built in the 1st millennium CE. Pottery found on the surface of a site can be from a later period of use of a much older structure. But it does say that people were using this site in the conventional dating range, which is itself consistent with the conventional interpretation. The stratigraphic analysis of the visible sections of the site, the exposed faces of the terraces where erosion or previous disturbance has revealed the layered structure, also provides dating information. The layers of soil accumulated between phases of construction and the artifacts found within those soil layers provide a relative chronology for the construction sequence. The conventional analysis of these layers is consistent with a construction history spanning several centuries within the 1st millennium CE. The conventional archaeology therefore tells a coherent story. A site constructed in multiple phases across several centuries during the Hindu-Buddhist period of West Javanese history. Used as a ceremonial and ritual space by the Sundanese people, and continuously venerated down to the present. This story is well supported by the available evidence from the surface terraces. What the Natawijaya team proposed was not that this story is wrong. They did not dispute that the surface terraces are of the dates the conventional analysis suggests. What they proposed was that this story is incomplete, that it describes only the most recent phase of activity at a site whose history extends much further back, into the deep prehistoric past. The conventional story is the visible part of the iceberg. The extraordinary claim is about what lies beneath the waterline, and the only way to investigate what lies beneath the waterline is to look below the surface, which is what Natawijaya did. And what he found, or what he believed he found, is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. But before we can evaluate what he found, we need to understand the specific methods he used, and why those methods produced results that were both compelling and controversial. The methods are the key. Because in science, the quality of a conclusion is inseparable from the quality of the method that produced it. And the methods at Gunung Padang are where the debate has been most fierce. Let me spend more time with the conventional archaeological picture of prehistoric Java specifically, because it provides essential context for understanding why the conventional view of Gunung Padang was what it was, and why a date of 20,000 BCE would be so far outside the expected range. Java is one of the most historically significant islands in Southeast Asia. It is the most densely populated island in the world, home today to more than 150 million people. And it has been inhabited by hominins for an extraordinarily long time. The fossils of Homo erectus found at Trinil in East Java in the 1890s by the Dutch paleontologist Eugène Dubois were among the first hominin fossils discovered outside of Europe, and they represent a population that lived in Java more than 1 million years ago. The transition from Homo erectus to anatomically modern Homo sapiens in Java is still imperfectly understood. The conventional view is that modern humans reached Southeast Asia and the islands of the Indonesian archipelago sometime after approximately 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, as part of the dispersal of modern humans out of Africa. The specific timing and route of this dispersal through the Indonesian archipelago is an active area of research, with new genetic and archaeological evidence continuing to refine the picture. What is clear from the archaeological record is that modern humans were in Java by at least 40,000 years ago, and possibly earlier. Cave sites in Java and Borneo have produced evidence of human occupation going back tens of thousands of years. Rock art in Sulawesi, including a famous image of a pig deer dated to approximately 45,000 years ago, demonstrates that the people of prehistoric Indonesia were engaged in sophisticated artistic activity at dates comparable to the oldest known art in Europe. So modern humans were in Java at the time when the deepest layers of Gunung Padang are proposed to have been constructed. The claim is not that modern humans were absent from the region at 20,000 BCE. They were not absent. The claim is that they were capable of organized, intentional, large-scale construction at that date, and that is where the conventional view resists. The conventional archaeological understanding of human behavior at 20,000 BCE in Southeast Asia is that people were living as mobile hunter-gatherers, using stone tools of the kind that characterize the Upper Paleolithic period globally, and not engaged in permanent settlement or monumental construction. This understanding is based on the absence of evidence for such construction at sites across the region, not just in Java but in Borneo, Sumatra, the Southeast Asian mainland, and the islands of the Pacific. The absence of evidence argument is less powerful in Southeast Asia than it might be in Europe or the Middle East, because the region has been much less intensively investigated archaeologically. The major sites in European and Near Eastern prehistory have been studied for over a century by thousands of archaeologists using sophisticated methods. The equivalent intensity of investigation has not been applied to the Indonesian archipelago, which is a vast and geographically complex region with relatively limited archaeological infrastructure. This matters for evaluating the conventional view of Gunung Padang. The absence of evidence for 20,000-year-old construction in Indonesia is partly a function of the absence of investigation. It does not necessarily mean that such construction did not exist, only that it has not been found. The conventional view is also shaped by the specific history of Indonesian archaeology as a discipline, which has its own institutional dynamics and its own relationship to the sites it studies. Indonesian archaeology developed largely under Dutch colonial rule, which imposed specific frameworks and priorities on the investigation of the archipelago's past. post-colonial Indonesian archaeology has worked to develop its own approaches and its own interpretive frameworks. But the legacy of the colonial period, including the specific sites that were prioritized for investigation and the specific questions that were considered most important, continues to shape the field. Within this institutional landscape, Gunung Padang was understood as one of many megalithic sites across the archipelago, significant within the regional tradition, but not requiring any special explanation. The extraordinary claim proposed by the Natawijaya team was not just a revision of a date, it was a challenge to the institutional framework within which the site had been understood for decades. That challenge produced a response that was partly scientific and partly institutional, partly about the evidence and partly about who gets to make claims about Indonesian prehistory and on what basis. Understanding this institutional dimension is important for evaluating the controversy fairly. The science matters, but so does the context in which the science is done. And in the case of Gunung Padang, the context is complex, politically charged, and not fully separable from the evidence. We will need to hold both simultaneously as we move forward. Let me also say something about the specific way that the conventional archaeological understanding of a site is formed, because it is not a neutral process, and understanding the process helps us understand the understanding. The conventional view of any archaeological site is the product of specific investigations conducted at specific times by specific researchers with specific methods, working within specific theoretical frameworks and specific institutional constraints. It is not a view from nowhere, it is a view from somewhere. From a particular disciplinary tradition, a particular moment in the history of the field, a particular set of questions that the researchers thought were important. In the case of Gunung Padang, the conventional view was largely formed in the second half of the 20th century by Indonesian archaeologists working within a framework that was informed partly by Dutch colonial archaeology and partly by the theoretical currents of international archaeology in the 1970s and 1980s. Those currents emphasized the importance of material culture, pottery, stone tools, architectural forms, as evidence of cultural identity and cultural change, and they were skeptical of claims about prehistoric human capability that went beyond what the material evidence directly demonstrated. This framework was well suited to understanding the surface terraces of Gunung Padang within the context of the Indonesian megalithic tradition. It was less well suited to investigating what might lie beneath the surface terraces, partly because the methods of the period were not oriented toward deep subsurface investigation of this kind, and partly because the theoretical framework did not generate the hypothesis that there might be something much older beneath the visible surface. The hypothesis that inspired the Natawijaya investigation came not from within the conventional framework of Indonesian archaeology, but from outside it, from a researcher whose primary training was in geology rather than archaeology, who approached the site with the questions that geologists ask rather than the questions that archaeologists ask. Geologists ask about the physical history of a landscape, about what has happened to the rock and the soil over time, about what processes have shaped the terrain, about what the subsurface might contain. When Danny Hillman Natawijaya looked at Gunung Padang, he looked at it as a geologist looks at a hill, asking what the physical structure of the hill is, what it is made of, how its present form was produced. The answers to those questions as his investigation proceeded were not what the conventional archaeological framework would have predicted. And that, ultimately, is why we are here tonight. Let me tell you about Danny Hillman Natawijaya. Natawijaya is a senior researcher at the Research Center for Geotechnology at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences, known by its Indonesian acronym LIPI, now reorganized as the National Research and Innovation Agency, or BRIN. He has a doctorate in geological sciences from the California Institute of Technology, and his professional work has been primarily in the field of tectonic geomorphology, the study of how tectonic forces shape the physical landscape. He has done significant work on the Sumatra fault system and on the geological record of past earthquakes in the Indonesian archipelago. He is, by any reasonable assessment, a credentialed and competent scientist with expertise in the geological investigation of Indonesian landscapes. He is also someone whose investigation of Gunung Padang has made him one of the most controversial figures in Indonesian scientific history, celebrated by those who believe his findings represent a genuine breakthrough in the understanding of Indonesian prehistory, and criticized by those who believe he overinterpreted ambiguous evidence in support of a predetermined conclusion. Nabta Wijaja's involvement with Gunung Padang began around 2010 when he joined a government-sponsored research team investigating the site. The team was multidisciplinary. It included archaeologists, geophysicists, and geologists. And its initial remit was to conduct a comprehensive survey of the site and its surrounding landscape as part of a broader effort to document and understand Indonesia's megalithic heritage. In the course of this initial survey, Nabta Wijaja and the geophysicists on the team conducted a series of non-invasive geophysical surveys of the hill, ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and electrical resistivity imaging. These techniques, as we discussed when we talked about their application at the Sphinx, allow researchers to image the subsurface geology of a site without drilling or digging. They produce maps of the subsurface that reveal variations in material density and composition. What the surveys at Gunung Padang showed was unexpected. The internal structure of the hill did not look like a natural volcanic hill with a surface megalithic structure on top of it. The geophysical images suggested the presence of subsurface voids, spaces within the hill that could represent chambers or rooms, and anomalous material densities at depth that were difficult to explain by reference to the known geology of the hill alone. The specific pattern of anomalies suggested to Nabta Wijaja and his colleagues that the hill might have a more complex artificial structure than the conventional view assumed. The conventional view was that the basalt columns on the surface had been arranged by human hands, but that the underlying hill was a natural geological feature. The geophysical data seemed to suggest that the artificial construction extended significantly deeper into the hill than the surface terraces. This was a significant hypothesis. To test it, the team obtained permission to drill into the hill, to extract core samples from the subsurface that could be physically examined and dated. Core drilling is a standard geological technique. A rotating drill bit, typically fitted with a diamond-cutting surface, is used to drill a narrow cylindrical hole into the rock or soil. As the drill descends, it extracts a continuous cylinder of material, the core sample, that represents a cross-section through the subsurface layers. The core sample can then be examined to characterize the materials it contains, and organic material within the core can be carbon dated to determine when those organic materials were deposited. Carbon dating, more formally, radiocarbon dating, works by measuring the proportion of the radioactive isotope carbon-14 in organic material. All living organisms incorporate carbon-14 from the atmosphere as they grow. When the organism dies, the carbon-14 begins to decay at a known rate. Its half-life is approximately 5,730 years. By measuring the proportion of carbon-14 remaining in a sample of organic material, the time since the organism died can be calculated. The technique is reliable for organic material up to approximately 50,000 years old. For material older than this, the amount of carbon-14 remaining is too small to measure reliably with conventional techniques. though newer methods have extended the practical range somewhat. For the dates being proposed at Gunung Padang, up to 25,000 BCE, carbon dating is within its reliable range. The core samples extracted from Gunung Padang were examined for organic content. In the soil layers near the surface, the team found organic material consistent with the conventional dating. Charcoal and other remains dated to the first millennium CE and earlier, consistent with the conventional archaeological understanding of the site. But as the drills went deeper, they found something unexpected. At depths of several meters below the surface terraces, the core samples began to show organic material at much earlier dates. Charcoal samples from depths of 5 to 7 meters were dated to approximately 5,000 BCE. Samples from depths of 8 to 10 meters were dated to approximately 10,000 BCE. And samples from the deepest layers drilled at depths of approximately 15 meters were dated to between 20,000 and 25,000 BCE. These dates, if they meant what the team believed they meant, were extraordinary. The team's interpretation was that the organic material in the cores had been incorporated into the structure of the hill during the construction of subsurface architectural features at these depths. In other words, they believed the carbon-dated material represented the remains of organic debris, charcoal from fires, plant material, that had been deposited by human builders at the time of construction. If this interpretation were correct, the subsurface structure of Gunung Padang had been built in multiple phases, with the deepest phase dating to the last glacial maximum. The interpretation depends critically on a specific assumption that the organic material in the cores was incorporated by human activity rather than by natural processes. This assumption is where the most serious controversy arose. Organic material can be deposited in subsurface layers by many processes that have nothing to do with human activity. Water movement through soil carries organic particles downward over time, a process called eluviation. Root systems of trees and other plants penetrate deep into soil layers, and when those roots decay, they leave organic material at depth. Soil animals, earthworms, beetles, ants, carry organic material downward as they burrow. Natural fires produce charcoal that can be washed into subsurface layers by rainwater. Any of these processes can produce ancient organic material at depth in a soil profile without any human involvement. The presence of organic material dated to 25,000 BCE at 15 meters depth does not, by itself, prove that anything was constructed at that depth at that date. It proves that carbon-dated organic material of that age is present at that depth. The interpretation of what put it there requires additional evidence. This is the central methodological dispute. Natawijaja and his team argued that the context of the organic material, the specific association between the dated material and anomalous features visible in the cores, features they interpreted as shaped stone and man-made fills, demonstrated that the material was associated with human construction rather than natural deposition. Their critics argued that the evidence for human construction in the cores was not conclusive, and that natural processes could explain the presence of ancient organic material without any need to invoke a 25,000-year-old constructed structure. The resolution of this dispute requires detailed analysis of the core material, examination of the specific texture and composition of the fills, the arrangement of the stone material, the chemistry of the organic deposits, and comparison with the natural geological context of the hill. Some of this analysis was conducted by the team and reported in their publications. Critics argued that the analysis was insufficient and that the interpretations were not supported by the evidence as presented. The specific technical debate is granular and demanding. Let me give you the clearest version of the dispute I can. The team reported finding in the cores at depth layers of what they described as man-made fills, compacted mixtures of soil and stone that they argued were inconsistent with natural sedimentation. They also reported finding, at some depths, stones that appeared to have been shaped or arranged by human hands, rather than deposited by natural geological processes. Critics responded that the distinction between natural and artificial fills in a basaltic volcanic landscape is not always clear, because the natural weathering and fragmentation of columnar basalt can produce compact layers of angular stone fragments that resemble manufactured fills. They also questioned whether the specific stones identified as shaped were genuinely the product of human tool use rather than natural fracturing. These are exactly the kinds of technical disputes that get resolved, in the best case, by additional sampling, additional analysis, and independent replication by researchers with no stake in the outcome. At Gunung Padang, that process was interrupted by the retractions and the institutional controversy before it could be completed. The evidence remains contested. The cores are still there. The dates are still real. What they mean is still the question. Let me stay with the moment of the discovery for a while, because there is something worth inhabiting in the experience of a scientist confronting data that does not fit the framework. Imagine being Nata when the first carbon dates from the deep cores came back from the laboratory. You are a trained geologist. You know how radiocarbon dating works. You know the reliability of the technique within its range. You know that the laboratory results you are reading represent the best available measurement of when those organic materials were last living. And the number is 20,000 BCE. Not 2000 BCE. Not 5,000 BCE. 20,000 years before the Christian era, when ice sheets covered much of the northern hemisphere and sea levels were 100 meters lower than today. The first response of any good scientist is not excitement. It is skepticism. When data contradicts the expected result by an enormous margin, the first question is not how do we explain this extraordinary result, but what went wrong? What was contaminated? What was mislabeled? What was a procedural error in the laboratory or the field? Good science is designed to fail. A good scientist's first response to unexpected data is to try to disprove it, to find the error, the contamination, the procedural flaw that explains the anomaly. Only when that attempt fails, when the data survives every effort to explain it away, does a good scientist begin to take the anomaly seriously as a genuine finding. Nata and his team went through this process. The carbon dating was repeated. Samples from multiple locations were dated independently. The laboratory procedures were reviewed. The field collection protocols were examined. The dates held up. This does not prove the dates are correct. It proves that the dating process produced consistent results under repeated investigation. Consistency is necessary, but not sufficient for correctness. It shows that the same error was not being made repeatedly, but it does not rule out a systematic error, affecting all the measurements in the same way. The systematic error that critics pointed to was not in the laboratory procedures, but in the field collection. Specifically, in the question of whether the organic material dated in the cores was genuinely associated with the features interpreted as human construction, or whether it was naturally deposited material that happened to be present at the same depth. This is a genuine and serious objection, and it points to a fundamental challenge in the archaeology of buried sites. You cannot date a construction event directly. You can only date organic material that was present at the time of the construction event. If that organic material is naturally occurring, if it was in the soil before the construction, or if it infiltrated the layers after the construction, then the date of the organic material does not give you the date of the construction. The specific argument Natawidjaja made against the natural deposition interpretation was that the organic material was found in association with specific features in the cores that he interpreted as manufactured fills and shaped stones. In other words, he argued that the organic material was not randomly distributed through the soil profile, but was specifically associated with archaeological features, and that this association indicated that the material was deposited at the same time as the construction of those features. Critics argued that this association was not demonstrated conclusively in the published papers, that the evidence for the manufactured fills and shaped stones was not sufficiently robust to support the inference that the organic material was archaeologically associated with construction rather than naturally deposited. The specific nature of the evidence in the cores, what the fills looked like, how the stones were arranged, what the chemical signature of the organic deposits was, is the kind of technical detail that requires direct examination of the core material to evaluate. Published papers, with their necessarily limited space and their dependency on photographs and descriptions rather than the physical material itself, provide an imperfect basis for adjudicating this dispute. Independent researchers who had direct access to the core material might have been able to resolve the dispute, but access to the cores was controlled by the research team, and independent examination was not straightforward. This is a recurring problem in controversial archaeological claims. The most decisive evidence, the physical material from the field, is held by the research team that collected it and that has a stake in the interpretation. Independent verification requires either access to the original material or independent replication of the sampling. Another team, drilling another set of cores, finding the same patterns. Independent replication at Gunung Padang has not been conducted in a systematic way, and in the absence of independent replication, the dispute about the deep cores remains unresolved. The dates are real. The question is what they date. Let me also spend time with the specific stratigraphy that the Natawidjaja team proposed, the model of how the different layers of the site are related to each other, because it is central to understanding both the claim and the criticism. Stratigraphy is the geological and archaeological study of rock and soil layers, their composition, their sequence, and what they tell us about the history of a site. The basic principle of stratigraphy is simple. In an undisturbed sequence, older layers are beneath younger ones. If you dig a trench through a site, the material at the bottom was deposited before the material at the top. At Gunung Padang, the stratigraphic model proposed by the research team was as follows. The visible surface terraces represent the most recent phase of construction, roughly dated by conventional archaeology to the first millennium CE, and possibly earlier. Beneath the surface terraces is a second, older phase of construction, dated by carbon dates to approximately 5,000 to 10,000 BCE. Beneath this second phase is a third, even older phase, dated to approximately 20,000 to 25,000 BCE. This model of three construction phases spanning an enormous time range is what made the claim so extraordinary. It meant that Gunung Padang was not just an old site. It was a site that had been returned to and rebuilt across a period spanning most of the history of modern humans in the region. Critics of the model raised two primary objections. The first was that the carbon dates from the deeper layers were dating natural organic material rather than construction events, that the stratigraphy was natural rather than artificial at the depths where the extraordinary dates were obtained. The second was that even if the carbon dates were dating something real, the specific interpretation of three phases of construction was not uniquely supported by the data. Other interpretations of the same data were possible, For example, the anomalous subsurface densities detected by the geophysical surveys could represent a natural lava tube complex within the basaltic hill rather than a constructed series of rooms and chambers. Lava tubes are a common feature of basaltic volcanic landscapes, and the geophysical signature of a lava tube can be similar to the signature of a constructed void in some survey conditions. The distinction between a natural lava tube and a constructed chamber would be apparent to a researcher with direct access to the core samples. The two produce different textures in the extracted material, different mineral compositions, different patterns of fracturing. But making this distinction from published photographs and descriptions without access to the physical material is difficult. This is the epistemological trap of the Gunung Padang controversy. The evidence that would resolve the central dispute, the physical core material, and the direct examination of the subsurface features, was not made sufficiently accessible for independent evaluation. The published papers described the evidence but could not fully substitute for direct examination. And the retraction of the 2023 Nature paper, before independent replication was attempted, means that the opportunity to settle the question through the normal processes of scientific peer review and replication may have been lost. The hill is still there. The cores, if preserved, are still there. The question is whether anyone will return to ask it properly. Let me explain the geophysical evidence in full. The non-invasive surveys that Natawijaja's team conducted at Gunung Padang, the ground-penetrating radar, the seismic tomography, and the electrical resistivity imaging represent the foundation of the structural argument. Before any drilling, before any carbon dates, these surveys suggested that Gunung Padang was more than a natural hill with a surface megalithic structure. They suggested a complex internal architecture. Ground-penetrating radar, or GPR, works by transmitting pulses of radio energy into the ground and measuring the reflections that return from subsurface boundaries. When a pulse of radio energy encounters a boundary between two materials with different electrical properties, a change from soil to rock, or from solid rock to a void, some of the energy is reflected back to the surface where it is detected by a receiver. By measuring the time it takes for the reflected pulse to return, and knowing the speed at which radio waves travel through different materials, researchers can map the depth and geometry of the subsurface boundaries. GPR is routinely used in archaeology to detect buried structures, walls, and chambers without excavation. At sites like Stonehenge, GPR surveys have revealed a previously unknown complex of buried features around the famous stone circle. At Gunung Padang, the GPR surveys produced images showing a series of anomalous features beneath the surface terraces, features that the research team interpreted as evidence of subsurface rooms, walls, and passages. The specific anomalies appeared at multiple depths, consistent with the multi-phase construction model. The shallowest anomalies were at depths of 1 to 2 meters, consistent with subsurface features associated with the visible surface terraces. Deeper anomalies at depths of 5 to 10 meters corresponded to the second proposed construction phase. The deepest anomalies, at 15 meters and below, corresponded to the proposed earliest construction phase. Electrical resistivity imaging works on a different principle. It measures the resistance of the subsurface material to the passage of electrical current. Different materials have different electrical resistivities. Dry rock is highly resistive. Wet soil is less resistive. Voids filled with air are extremely resistive. By passing electrical current through the ground at multiple points and measuring the resistance at multiple receiver points, researchers can produce maps of the subsurface resistivity structure that reveal the distribution of different materials. The resistivity surveys at Gunung Padang showed a pattern of subsurface anomalies broadly consistent with the GPR results. Regions of high resistivity at depth that the research team interpreted as air-filled voids or chambers, surrounded by regions of lower resistivity consistent with soil and weathered rock. Seismic tomography, the third technique, uses sound waves rather than radio waves or electrical current. A seismic source at the surface generates a sound wave that travels through the subsurface and is recorded at multiple receiver points. The speed at which the sound wave travels through different materials depends on the density and rigidity of those materials. Denser, more rigid materials transmit sound faster than less dense or more porous materials. By measuring the travel times of seismic waves between multiple source and receiver combinations, researchers can produce three-dimensional maps of the subsurface seismic velocity structure. The seismic surveys at Gunung Padang showed regions of anomalously low seismic velocity at depth, regions where the sound waves were traveling more slowly than expected for solid basalt. The research team interpreted these low-velocity zones as evidence of voids or chambers filled with less dense material. Taken together, the three geophysical techniques produced a consistent picture. The hill contains subsurface features that are anomalous relative to the expected geology of a natural basaltic hill. The anomalies are concentrated in specific locations that correspond roughly to what you would expect from a multi-level buried structure. This is the point at which the argument becomes genuinely interesting and genuinely contested. The consistency of the anomalies across three independent geophysical techniques is significant. Each technique has different sensitivities and different limitations, and the fact that all three show anomalies in roughly the same locations provides stronger evidence than any one technique alone would provide. The probability of three independent techniques all producing spurious anomalies in the same locations is lower than the probability of any one technique doing so. But the interpretation of geophysical anomalies as evidence of constructed voids rather than natural geological features requires additional justification. Natural basaltic hills can contain lava tubes, natural caves formed when the outer crust of a lava flow solidified while the interior was still liquid and eventually drained away. Lava tubes produce exactly the kind of geophysical signature that the research team observed: high resistivity, low seismic velocity, and GPR reflections consistent with void spaces. The Gunung Padang hill was formed by intrusive basalt that pushed up from below into existing rock rather than flowing across the surface as a lava flow. Strictly speaking, lava tubes of the classic kind require a surface lava flow, and intrusive basalt does not form lava tubes in the same way. But other types of natural void can form in intrusive basalt through weathering and fracturing processes, and the geophysical signature of such voids can be similar to the signature of constructed chambers. The research team addressed this issue by pointing to the specific geometry and distribution of the anomalies. They argued that the pattern of the anomalies, the way they are arranged and the way they relate to each other spatially, is more consistent with a constructed structure than with the random distribution of natural voids in a weathered basaltic hill. They argued that the anomalies show a regularity and a symmetry that natural geological processes do not typically produce. Critics were not persuaded. They argued that the visual interpretation of geophysical images, the process of looking at a map of subsurface anomalies and deciding whether their distribution looks more like a natural or an artificial feature, is inherently subjective and prone to confirmation bias. The human visual system is extraordinarily good at finding patterns, and researchers who are looking for evidence of a constructed structure will tend to see that evidence in ambiguous data. This is a legitimate methodological concern. Geophysical image interpretation is not a purely objective process. The The same data can be interpreted differently by different researchers, and researchers who are invested in a particular conclusion may interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that support that conclusion. The appropriate response to this concern is not to dismiss the geophysical evidence, but to subject it to independent review. To have geophysicists with no stake in the outcome examine the raw data and provide their own interpretation. Whether this independent review was conducted rigorously in the case of the Gunung Padang surveys is a question on which the accounts of those involved differ. The research team claimed that their surveys were independently validated. Critics claimed that the validation was inadequate. The specific technical dispute about the geophysical surveys is one of the three central areas of contention in the Gunung Padang debate, alongside the carbon dating interpretation and the interpretation of the core material. All three areas involve genuine technical complexity, and all three were unresolved at the time the papers were retracted. Unresolved does not mean unanswerable. Each of these disputes could in principle be addressed by additional investigation, more surveys, more cores, more independent analysis of the existing data. What is needed is not more extraordinary claims, but more careful, patient, independent investigation of the evidence that already exists. The hill is not going anywhere. The geophysical anomalies, if real, are not going anywhere. The question of what they represent is the question that needs to be answered, and it can only be answered by investigation that is patient enough, rigorous enough, and independent enough to follow the evidence wherever it leads, without the weight of a predetermined conclusion pressing on the analysis, without the need to produce a result that justifies the investment of time and money and reputation. Just the instruments and the data and the careful, honest reading of what the data says. Let me also think about what the geophysical evidence taken at face value would actually mean for our understanding of the site, if the anomalies are what the research team said they are. The multi-phase construction model proposed by Nata and his colleagues describes a site that was constructed, used, partially buried, and then built over again and again across a period of roughly 25,000 years. This is not unprecedented in principle. Sites across the world show evidence of construction activity spanning thousands of years, with later builders building on the remains of earlier ones. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried and rebuilt multiple times across 2,000 years. The great temple sites of Mesopotamia show construction histories spanning millennia, each generation of rulers adding to and modifying the structures left by their predecessors. But 25,000 years is not 2,000 years. It is not even 5,000 years. 25,000 years of continuous or repeated return to a single site for the purpose of construction and ritual activity would require a cultural tradition of extraordinary continuity, a tradition capable of maintaining knowledge of the site's significance and the motivation to return to it and build on it across a period spanning more than 100 generations. This is not impossible. Cultural traditions of extraordinary longevity do exist. The Aboriginal Australian tradition of connection to specific sacred sites, sites whose significance is maintained through oral tradition and ceremonial practice across tens of thousands of years, provides a documented example of cultural memory operating at the timescales the Gunung Padang model requires. The songlines of Aboriginal Australia connect specific landscape features to creation time events that occurred tens of thousands of years ago, and the specific knowledge of those connections has been maintained through unbroken cultural transmission from the time of the original events. If something similar were possible in prehistoric Southeast Asia, a tradition of connection to Gunung Padang maintained through ritual and oral transmission across the entire span of the last glacial maximum and the Holocene, then the multi-phase construction model is at least culturally conceivable, even if archaeologically unprecedented. The problem is that 25,000 years of oral tradition leaves no direct archaeological trace. We cannot excavate a tradition. We can only excavate the physical remains that the tradition motivated people to create. And the physical remains at Gunung Padang, as interpreted by the research team, are exactly what we have been discussing: the geophysical anomalies, the carbon-dated cores, the proposed multi-phase stratigraphy. The geophysical evidence is therefore not just evidence about the physical structure of the hill. It is evidence about the cultural history of the site, about what people did there, when they did it, and how long they continued doing it. The physical and the cultural are inseparable in the interpretation of an archaeological site. This is one of the reasons why the dispute about the geophysical evidence became so heated. It was not just a technical disagreement about the interpretation of resistivity images and seismic velocity maps. It was a disagreement about the entire picture of Southeast Asian prehistory, about who the people of this region were and what they were capable of. The critics of the research team were not just saying that the geophysical images had been misread. They were saying that the interpretation required a picture of prehistoric Southeast Asian humanity that the evidence did not support. A picture of people capable of organized, sustained, sophisticated construction activity 15,000 years before the conventional model says such activity was possible anywhere in the world. That is an enormous claim to hang on geophysical anomalies that have alternative natural explanations. And the burden of proof for such a claim is correspondingly enormous. The research team understood this. The specific care with which they assembled multiple lines of evidence, the geophysical surveys, the core drilling, the carbon dating, the petrographic analysis of the core material, reflects an awareness that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. They were trying to build a case robust enough to withstand the scrutiny they knew it would attract. Whether they succeeded in building that case is the judgment that the scientific community has now made, through the peer review process and ultimately through the retraction. But the judgment of the peer review process is not the final word on a scientific question. It is the current best assessment of whether a claim is supported by the evidence as presented. If new evidence emerges, or if the existing evidence is analysed differently, the judgment can change. The geophysical anomalies are still there. They have not been explained away. They have been found insufficient as presented to support the extraordinary conclusion drawn from them. That is a different thing from being explained. Let me close this part with a specific technical point that illustrates the difficulty of resolving these disputes without independent investigation. One of the most striking claims in the research team's papers was that the GPR surveys revealed the presence of what appeared to be rectangular rooms or chambers at depth. Subsurface voids with geometric shapes that were difficult to explain as natural geological features. Natural voids in basaltic rock, lava tubes, fracture zones, weathering cavities, tend to have irregular, rounded shapes that follow the natural patterns of the rock. Rectangular or angular shapes with approximately right-angle corners and flat walls are characteristic of constructed spaces. If the geometric interpretation of the GPR anomalies is correct, if the subsurface voids really do have the rectangular shapes that the research team described, then the argument for natural geological origin becomes significantly harder to make. Natural processes do not typically produce rectangular rooms. The problem is that GPR image interpretation involves a step of reconstruction from raw reflection data to an image of the subsurface. And this reconstruction step involves assumptions and algorithms that can introduce artifacts, apparent features in the image that do not correspond to real features in the subsurface. The apparent rectangularity of the anomalies in the GPR images could, in principle, be an artifact of the reconstruction algorithm rather than a real property of the subsurface features. Evaluating whether the apparent rectangularity is real or artifactual requires detailed knowledge of the specific GPR equipment used, the specific parameters of the survey, and the specific reconstruction algorithm applied to the raw data. This level of technical detail was not fully disclosed in the published papers, making independent evaluation difficult. This is not an accusation of misconduct. It is a description of the normal insufficiency of scientific papers as a medium for communicating the full technical detail of a complex geophysical investigation. Papers are necessarily concise. The full technical methodology of a complex survey might require a separate technical report of many pages that is not practical to include in a journal paper. The normal remedy for this insufficiency is independent replication. Another team, with their own equipment and their own methods, conducting their own surveys and comparing their results to the original. If independent surveys consistently show the same anomalies in the same locations, confidence in the reality of those anomalies increases substantially. Independent replication of the Gunung Padang geophysical surveys has not, to public knowledge, been conducted. This gap between the evidence that exists and the evidence that would be needed to resolve the dispute is the specific gap that the controversy about Gunung Padang currently occupies. It is a resolvable gap. It requires investigation, not argument. And the investigation has not yet happened. Let me tell you how the controversy erupted. The Gunung Padang research did not proceed quietly through the normal channels of scientific publication and peer review. It erupted into public view, into Indonesian political discourse, into international media coverage, in a way that was unusual even for a controversial scientific claim, and that shaped the subsequent reception of the research in ways that made fair evaluation more difficult. The first major public controversy around the site occurred in 2012 and 2013, when Nata and his team's preliminary findings, the early carbon dates, the geophysical anomalies, began to attract attention from the Indonesian media and from the Indonesian government. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono took a personal interest in the site, visiting Gunung Padang in 2012 and publicly expressing enthusiasm for the possibility that it might be an ancient pyramid of world historical significance. Presidential interest in an archaeological site is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it brings resources, funding, access, political support for the research program. On the other hand, it creates pressure, the expectation that the research will produce results commensurate with the presidential investment, the political difficulty of concluding that the site is less extraordinary than it appeared. The Indonesian archaeological establishment reacted to the presidential enthusiasm with alarm. A group of senior archaeologists issued a public statement expressing concern about the direction of the research, questioning the methods, the interpretations, and the rush to publish preliminary findings without adequate peer review. The specific concerns raised by Indonesian archaeologists were substantive. They questioned whether the carbon dating of the deep cores had adequately excluded the possibility of natural organic material deposition. They questioned whether the geophysical anomalies had been adequately distinguished from natural geological features. They questioned whether the team had the appropriate expertise in archaeology, as distinct from geology and geophysics, to interpret the evidence correctly. These are legitimate scientific concerns, but the public controversy around them took on a character that went beyond scientific debate. There were accusations of professional jealousy on both sides, accusations that the critics were protecting the conventional view for institutional reasons rather than scientific ones, and counter-accusations that the research team was exploiting political connections to bypass normal scientific scrutiny. The Indonesian government formed a special committee in 2013 to investigate the site and evaluate the research claims. The committee included archaeologists, geologists, and other scientists appointed by the Ministry of Education and Culture. Its remit was to assess the evidence and provide an authoritative assessment of what the research had actually established. The committee's conclusion was cautious. It acknowledged that the site was significant and worthy of further investigation, but was skeptical of the most extraordinary claims. It called for more rigorous investigation, more cores, more independently validated dating, more careful geological mapping, before any conclusions about the site's age could be drawn. This was a reasonable scientific response, but it was received differently by different parties to the dispute. The research team felt that the committee had not engaged adequately with the full body of evidence they had produced. The critics felt that the committee had been too lenient, that a stronger rebuke of the methodology was warranted. The dispute continued in various forms for the next decade, through additional fieldwork, additional publications, and eventually the 2023 Nature paper that brought the controversy to international attention. Let me now describe the specific parallel between the Gunung Padang controversy and the Sphinx water erosion debate that we explored in the previous video, because the parallels are real and instructive. In both cases, a researcher with credentials in a geological field, a geologist in the case of Schoch, a geologist and geophysicist in the case of Nabta, applied the methods of their discipline to an archaeological site and produced findings that implied the site was significantly older than the conventional archaeological dating suggested. In both cases, the extraordinary claim was based on physical evidence. The weathering morphology of limestone in the Sphinx case, the carbon dates and geophysical anomalies in the Gunung Padang case, that could in principle be tested and evaluated by independent researchers. In both cases, the archaeological establishment responded with a mixture of legitimate scientific skepticism and territorial defensiveness. The legitimate skepticism focused on the specific methodological questions about whether the physical evidence had been correctly interpreted. The territorial defensiveness focused on the credentials and the disciplinary standing of the researchers making the claims. In both cases, the dispute was complicated by political dimensions. In the Sphinx case, the Egyptian government's control over access to the monument made independent investigation difficult. In the Gunung Padang case, the Indonesian president's personal involvement created political pressure that distorted the normal process of scientific evaluation. And in both cases, the central question, whether the physical evidence properly interpreted supports an extraordinary revision of the conventional timeline, remains genuinely unresolved. The parallels suggest something important about the sociology of scientific disputes at the boundary between geology and archaeology. When a geologist finds physical evidence that implies an archaeological conclusion that archaeologists find implausible, the specific dynamics of the dispute are shaped by disciplinary boundaries, institutional protections, and the difficulty of finding methodological common ground between researchers trained in different traditions. Geologists and archaeologists ask different questions, use different methods, and have different standards for what counts as adequate evidence. When the same physical material is interpreted by a geologist as evidence of an ancient construction event, and by an archaeologist as a natural deposit, the dispute cannot be resolved simply by each side presenting their interpretation more forcefully. It requires the development of shared methodological standards that both disciplines can accept. This methodological convergence is genuinely difficult to achieve, and the difficulty is not the fault of any individual participant in the debate. It is a structural feature of disputes that cross disciplinary boundaries. The Gunung Padang controversy is, in part, a dispute about who has the authority to determine the age of an archaeological site. Whether it is archaeologists who have the interpretive framework for understanding human behavior in the past, or geologists who have the physical methods for dating and characterizing the material evidence. The answer, in principle, is both. That the most robust conclusions come from integrating the evidence from both disciplines, using the standards and the expertise of each where they are most relevant. In practice, achieving this integration requires collaboration that the institutional structure of the dispute has made difficult. The controversy did not produce collaboration, it produced conflict. And the conflict, more than anything else, is what prevented the resolution of a question that is, in principle, resolvable. The hill is not the problem. The institutions are, and institutions, unlike hills, can change. Let me go deeper into what happened to the public discourse around Gunung Padang, because the media and political dimension of the controversy is not just background noise. It actively shaped the scientific debate in ways that were largely destructive. When President Yudhoyono visited the site in 2012 and expressed enthusiasm for the pyramid hypothesis, the idea that Gunung Padang was an ancient buried pyramid comparable to or older than the pyramids of Egypt. The story became much bigger than a technical dispute about carbon dating and geophysical survey interpretation. It became a story about Indonesian national identity. The specific framing that emerged in some Indonesian media was one in which Gunung Padang represented evidence that Indonesian civilization was as ancient and as sophisticated as any civilization in the world. The narrative of a 25,000-year-old structure in Java, predating the pyramids, predating Stonehenge, predating Göbekli Tepe, predating everything, was not just a scientific claim. It was a claim about Indonesia's place in the story of human civilization. This nationalist framing made the scientific debate much harder to conduct fairly. Critics of the research risked being positioned as attacking Indonesian national heritage, as agents of a Western academic establishment unwilling to credit non-Western civilizations with their true achievements. Supporters of the research could frame their position as defending Indonesian cultural pride against institutional skepticism. These framings are distortions of what was actually at stake. The scientific question, whether the physical evidence supports the extraordinary dating claims, has nothing to do with national identity or cultural pride. A careful, rigorous investigation that concluded the site was not 25,000 years old would not diminish Indonesia's cultural heritage. It would simply produce an accurate understanding of a significant and genuinely interesting site. But the nationalist framing, once established in the media, was difficult to dislodge. It created a context in which scientific criticism of the research could be dismissed as political rather than scientific, and in which the researchers themselves had strong external pressure to maintain and defend their most extraordinary claims, rather than subjecting them to rigorous, self-critical scrutiny. This is one of the ways in which media and political attention damages scientific investigation. Not necessarily through direct interference. No one was ordering the researchers to find a 25,000-year-old pyramid, but through the creation of a context in which modifying or abandoning the extraordinary claim became institutionally and politically costly. The parallel with the Sphinx debate is instructive here too. When Zahi Hawass became personally identified with the defense of the conventional dating of the Sphinx, the debate became partly about his personal authority and his management of Egyptian archaeological resources, not just about the geological evidence. The institutional stakes on both sides of the Sphinx dispute made honest scientific engagement more difficult. At Gunung Padang, the institutional stakes were even higher, because the Indonesian president had personally endorsed the most extraordinary interpretation of the evidence. The political cost of contradicting the presidential enthusiasm was significant, and the political reward for confirming it was also significant. This kind of political entanglement is not unique to Indonesia or to this specific dispute. The history of science is full of cases where political pressures from governments, from funding agencies, from ideological movements, distorted the course of scientific investigation. Lysenkoism in the Soviet Union is the most dramatic example. A case where a politically endorsed theory was imposed on an entire scientific discipline with disastrous consequences for Soviet agriculture. Less dramatically but more pervasively, the funding structures of modern science create systematic pressures toward the confirmation of existing hypotheses and the production of positive results. The Gunung Padang case sits somewhere in this landscape. A case where the pressure from political enthusiasm and media attention created conditions in which the normal, self-correcting mechanisms of science had difficulty operating. Let me also say something about the specific critics who spoke out most forcefully against the research claims, because their concerns deserve to be heard on their merits, rather than dismissed as institutional defensiveness. Among the most vocal critics was Lutfi Yondri, an Indonesian archaeologist at the National Research and Innovation Agency, who specializes in the prehistoric archaeology of West Java, and who has extensive field experience with sites in the region where Gunung Padang is located. Yondri's criticisms were specific and technical. He questioned the archaeological interpretation of the core material, arguing that the features identified by the research team as man-made fills were consistent with natural soil formation processes in a volcanic landscape. Yondri also raised concerns about the research team's lack of expertise in Indonesian prehistoric archaeology, the specific regional knowledge that allows a researcher to distinguish between anthropogenic features and natural features in this specific geological and cultural context. This is a legitimate point. The interpretation of subsurface features in an archaeological site requires not just general expertise in geological methods, but specific knowledge of what the natural and cultural processes of the region produce. A geophysicist trained to read GPR images may not have the specific regional expertise to distinguish between a naturally compacted volcanic soil layer and a deliberately constructed fill in a West Javan context. That distinction requires knowledge of the local geology, the local cultural traditions, and the specific ways that the two interact. Knowledge that comes from extensive fieldwork in the region, not just from expertise in geophysical methods. These are not trivial concerns. They point to a genuine methodological limitation of the research, not a fatal flaw, but a gap that should have been addressed through closer collaboration with Indonesian prehistoric archaeologists who had the relevant regional expertise. The absence of that collaboration, or the inadequacy of it, is one of the specific weaknesses of the research program as conducted, and it is a weakness that better institutional conditions might have remedied. The controversy might have been more productive if it had produced collaboration rather than conflict. The site would have benefited from both the geological expertise of Natawijaja's team and the archaeological expertise of his critics, working together toward a shared understanding of the evidence. That collaboration did not happen, and the question of what Gunung Padang is remains open, partly as a result. Let me think about what a better version of this controversy might have looked like, what the institutional conditions for good science in a case like this would require. The ideal would have been something like this. The initial geophysical surveys produce anomalous results. The research team, before publishing extraordinary claims, invites independent geophysicists and archaeologists to examine the raw survey data and provide their independent interpretation. the independent reviewers find that the anomalies are real but ambiguous, consistent with both natural and artificial origins. The team designs a drilling program specifically intended to distinguish between these two possibilities, targeting locations where the distinction between natural and artificial fills should be most clearly visible in the core material. The cores are extracted and described in real time by a team that includes both the original researchers and independent archaeologists with regional expertise. The organic material is sampled for carbon dating by an independent laboratory, and the dating results are provided to both teams simultaneously. The interpretation of the cores, whether the fills are natural or artificial, is documented in detail, with photographic records and written descriptions that are sufficiently detailed to allow independent evaluation. The results are then published with the full dataset, the raw geophysical data, the core photographs, the laboratory reports, made available alongside the paper so that independent researchers can evaluate the primary evidence rather than relying on the team's interpretation of it. This would be science at its best. It would be slow. It would be expensive. It would require a level of institutional trust and collaborative spirit that is rare in any competitive discipline. It did not happen at Gunung Padang. Instead, a team with significant institutional investment in a specific interpretation conducted the investigation, interpreted the results, published their conclusions, attracted extraordinary media and political attention, and then faced a critical response that was partly scientific and partly institutional, and that eventually produced a retraction without producing resolution. The retraction is not the end of the story. It is a statement that the evidence, as presented in the 2023 Nature paper, was insufficient to support the conclusion. It is not a statement that the site is what the conventional view says it is. It is not a statement that the anomalies have been explained. It is not a statement that the investigation should stop. It is a statement that this particular paper, with its particular presentation of the evidence, did not meet the standard for publication in a scientific journal. That standard is a high one. It should be. And the failure to meet it does not mean the underlying question is uninteresting or that the underlying evidence is worthless. It means the investigation needs to continue more carefully, more collaboratively, more patiently. The hill will wait. Let me try to make you feel what 20,000 BCE actually means. Not the number, the reality, the specific quality of the world at that moment, what it looked like, what lived in it, who the humans were and how they were living. 20,000 years before the Christian era is 22,000 years before the present. It falls in the middle of the last glacial maximum, the period of greatest ice sheet extent in the most recent glacial cycle, which peaked between roughly 26,000 and 19,000 years ago. At the peak of the last glacial maximum, the world was radically different from the world we live in. The Laurentide ice sheet covered most of North America, from the Pacific coast of what is now Alaska South to approximately the latitude of New York, and from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast. It was in places more than 3 kilometers thick. The weight of this ice depressed the bedrock beneath it by hundreds of meters. Where the ice sheet met the sea, vast glaciers carved icebergs into an ocean that was dramatically colder than today. The Fennoscandian ice sheet covered Scandinavia, northern Britain, and the northern parts of what are now Germany, Poland, and Russia. The Alps were covered by their own ice cap. The Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau were more extensively glaciated than today. Ice covered large parts of what is now Patagonia and the southern tip of South America. Sea levels were approximately 120 meters lower than today. This is not a small difference. It is equivalent to the height of a 40-story building. At this sea level, Enormous areas of what are now shallow continental shelves were dry land. The Bering Land Bridge connected Siberia to Alaska, allowing the first humans to enter the Americas. The islands of Southeast Asia, Sumatra, Java, Borneo, Bali, were connected to each other and to the Asian mainland by the dry land of the Sunda Shelf. The island of Java, where Gunung Padang is located, was not an island. It was a peninsula extending east from the mainland. This geographical fact has specific implications for understanding who might have been in the Gunung Padang area at 20,000 BCE. The landscape around the site would have been very different from its present form. The hill itself would have been there. It is part of the geological substrate of the landscape that is not dramatically changed by glacial cycles. But the surrounding landscape would have been connected by land to a much larger territory, and the climate would have been cooler and drier than today. The human population of the world at 20,000 BCE was, as we noted in the first part of tonight's journey, probably in the range of 1 to 3 million people globally. These people were distributed across the habitable land surfaces of the world, in Africa, in Eurasia, in Southeast Asia, in Australia, and beginning to cross into the Americas. They were anatomically modern Homo sapiens, cognitively and neurologically identical to modern humans. They were not our inferiors in any meaningful sense. They were us, living in radically different material conditions. What they were doing across most of the world was hunting and gathering. They were following the migrations of the animals they hunted, moving seasonally between areas of seasonal food abundance, maintaining social groups of perhaps 20 to 50 people, and accumulating the specific knowledge of plants, animals, landscapes, seasons, and the skills of tool-making and shelter building that allowed them to survive in the specific environments they occupied. They were also, as we now know, capable of sophisticated symbolic thought and complex artistic expression. The cave paintings of southern France and northern Spain, Lascaux, Altamira, Chauvet, were made by people living at or near the last glacial maximum. The oldest confirmed cave paintings at the Chauvet cave in France have been dated to approximately 36,000 years ago. The art at Lascaux dates to approximately 17,000 years ago, within 3,000 years of the period we are discussing. These paintings are extraordinary. The specific rendering of animal movement, the understanding of anatomy, the use of cave surfaces to create three-dimensional effects, the multi-layered compositions. These are not the crude scratchings of primitive minds. They are the work of accomplished artists who understood what they were doing and were doing it deliberately and skillfully. The people of the last glacial maximum were not primitive. They were different from us in their material circumstances. They did not have cities or writing or metallurgy or agriculture, but in their cognitive capacity, their social complexity, and their cultural sophistication, they were fully human. This matters for evaluating the Gunung Padang claim. The claim is not that 20,000-year-old people were incapable of intelligence or symbolic thought. They were demonstrably capable of both. The claim is that they were incapable of organized, sustained, large-scale stone construction. And this is a specific capability that the evidence, as we understand it, did not emerge until much later. Why? The conventional explanation for the late emergence of monumental construction is not cognitive. It is organizational and economic. Hunter-gatherer societies of the last glacial maximum were mobile. They moved through their landscapes in response to the seasonal availability of food. Mobility is incompatible with the sustained, concentrated collective labor that large-scale construction requires. You cannot build a pyramid while following the mammoth herds. More precisely, you can build a simple structure, a shelter, a windbreak, a pit, that requires a few hours or a few days of collective effort by a small group. But You cannot build a structure that requires months or years of sustained effort by hundreds of workers unless those workers can remain in one place for the duration of the project. And remaining in one place for months or years requires a food supply that can sustain the workers without requiring them to range widely in search of food. This food supply, the reliable, locally concentrated food production that makes sedentary life possible, is what agriculture provides. The emergence of agriculture between 10,000 and 5,000 BCE created the specific economic conditions that allowed human societies to become sedentary, to grow larger, to develop greater social complexity, and to undertake the organized collective labor that monumental construction requires. Göbekli Tepe challenges this narrative by demonstrating that monumental construction preceded agriculture, that hunter-gatherers in southeastern Turkey at 10,000 BCE were capable of organized, sustained construction on a significant scale. But Göbekli Tepe's challenge is relatively modest. 10,000 BCE is late in the hunter-gatherer period. It falls within the Mesolithic, the period of transition between the mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle of the Paleolithic and the sedentary agricultural lifestyle of the Neolithic. The people who built Göbekli Tepe may have been in the early stages of the transition to a more settled lifestyle, even if they had not yet adopted full agriculture. 25,000 BCE is not the Mesolithic. It is the middle of the Paleolithic, the period of the cave painters, the mammoth hunters, the fully mobile foraging lifestyle. The gap between Göbekli Tepe and the proposed earliest date for Gunung Padang is not a gap within the transition to agriculture. It is a gap between two entirely different regimes of human existence. This is why the Gunung Padang claim is so extraordinary. It is not just extending the timeline of monumental construction by a few thousand years. It is proposing that monumental construction occurred 15,000 years before the period in which it is currently believed to have first become possible. That would require either a fundamental revision of the model of what hunter-gatherer societies were capable of, or the existence of a specific population in Southeast Asia at 20,000 BCE that was living in a way significantly different from the general pattern of human life at that period. A population that had, for reasons we do not understand, developed the specific organizational and economic conditions that normally require agriculture. Neither of these possibilities is impossible. The model of hunter-gatherer capability has already been revised once by Göbekli Tepe. And the specific conditions of Southeast Asia during the last glacial maximum, the Sunda shelfland connection, the specific productivity of the tropical environment, the specific cultural traditions of the region, may have supported ways of life that are not yet fully understood. But the burden of proof for a claim this extraordinary is correspondingly high. The evidence as presented in the 2023 Nature paper was not sufficient to meet that burden. Whether the evidence that exists at the site, the cores, the anomalies, the stratigraphy, might meet that burden if more carefully and more independently analysed is the question that the retraction has left unanswered. And it is a question worth asking. Let me try to inhabit the world of 20,000 BCE more fully, to spend more time with what daily life looked like for the people who were contemporaries of whoever is proposed to have built the earliest phase of Gunung Padang. The people of Southeast Asia at 20,000 BCE were living in the Sunda shelf landscape, the connected landmass that included what are now the islands of Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and Bali, along with the peninsulas of Southeast Asia and large areas of what is now the Java Sea and the South China Sea. This landscape, now submerged under 100 meters of water, was at that time a vast and presumably productive lowland environment, tropical or subtropical in climate, with rivers draining from the mountainous interiors of the islands to be into broad coastal plains. The specific ecology of the Sunda shelf lowlands during the last glacial maximum is imperfectly known because the evidence for it is now underwater. We know from the high altitude sites that have survived, the hill and cave sites of the region that were above sea level then and remain above sea level now, that the region was inhabited by modern humans across a wide range of environments, including coastal, lowland, and montane habitats. The human communities that occupied this landscape at 20,000 BCE were almost certainly diverse in their specific subsistence strategies, their social organization, and their cultural traditions. Some may have been primarily coastal, exploiting the rich marine resources of a shallow tropical sea. Others may have been inland hunters and gatherers, exploiting the large mammalian fauna of the Sunda shelf. Others may have occupied transitional environments, moving between coastal and inland resources across the year. What we do not know, because the relevant sites are now underwater and cannot be easily investigated, is whether any of these communities had developed a level of sedentism, social complexity, and organizational capacity that would have allowed them to undertake large-scale stone construction. The drowned landscape of the Sunda shelf is one of the most important but least investigated archaeological environments in the world. Sites that would help us understand the human communities of this region at the last glacial maximum are inaccessible under 100 meters of water, in waters that are warm, turbid, and subject to strong currents that disperse and bury surface material. Underwater archaeology in these conditions is technically extremely demanding and prohibitively expensive with current technology. The archaeological record of last glacial maximum Southeast Asia is therefore severely limited by the submergence of the most productive environments of the period. The sites we have access to, the cave and hill sites that were above sea level then as now, are a biased sample of the full range of environments and the full range of human communities that existed in the region. This is a specific and important caveat for evaluating the Gunung Padang claim. The absence of evidence for complex, organized human communities in Southeast Asia at 20,000 BCE is partly a function of where the evidence is. The most productive environments of the period are now underwater. The sites we can investigate are not representative. Does this mean a 25,000-year-old construction at Gunung Padang is plausible? Not necessarily. The hill site where Gunung Padang is located was accessible at 20,000 BCE. It was above sea level, surrounded by the Sunda shelf lowlands, part of a connected landscape that supported human communities across a wide area. If any community in the region had the capability for large-scale stone construction, they had access to the site. But having access to a site and having the organizational capacity to build a major stone structure are different things. And the specific organizational capacity, the ability to concentrate hundreds of workers in one place, feed them, organize their labor and direct it toward a specific large-scale construction goal, is what the conventional model of last glacial maximum hunter-gatherer societies says did not yet exist. The specific challenge of the Gunung Padang claim is therefore this: to explain not just that people were in the right place at the right time, but that they had developed, for reasons that are not yet understood, in a region that is not yet adequately investigated. A form of social organization that was dramatically ahead of what is documented anywhere else in the world at the same period. That explanation has not been provided. It may be provided in the future as the archaeology of Southeast Asian prehistory develops. Or it may not. The honest position is that we do not know. And the specific difficulty of knowing, the drowned landscape, the inaccessible evidence, the limited investigation, is a real obstacle that makes the question harder to resolve than comparable questions in better investigated regions. The world of 20,000 BCE is still being recovered, very slowly, from under 100 meters of tropical sea. Let me close this part with a thought about the specific value of maintaining intellectual openness about questions like the Gunung Padang claim, even when the extraordinary claim has been retracted and the evidence is contested. There is a tension in thinking about claims of this kind between two important intellectual virtues. The first is skepticism, the disposition to require extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims, to be resistant to interpretations that go far beyond what the evidence can support, and to be alert to the ways in which motivated reasoning can produce conclusions that feel compelling but are not justified. The second is openness, the disposition to follow evidence where it leads, even when it points in uncomfortable or unexpected directions, to resist the temptation to dismiss anomalous findings simply because they contradict established views, and to maintain genuine uncertainty about questions that the evidence cannot yet definitively resolve. These two virtues are in tension because exercising them well requires different things at different times. When a claim is extraordinary and the evidence is weak, skepticism is the more important virtue. When a claim is contested and the evidence is ambiguous, openness is the more important virtue. The difficulty is in judging which situation applies. The Gunung Padang case sits in the ambiguous middle. The claim is extraordinary, one of the most extraordinary in recent archaeology. The evidence is contested. The same data has been interpreted as supporting both the extraordinary claim and much more conventional explanations. The retraction of the 2023 paper is a significant signal that the extraordinary interpretation was not adequately supported by the evidence as presented. Given all this, the appropriate response is neither the enthusiastic endorsement that the claim received in some quarters, nor the dismissive skepticism that some critics adopted. It is the careful, patient, genuinely uncertain engagement that difficult questions deserve. The people of 20,000 BCE were real. They lived in this landscape. They looked up at this hill. Whatever they did or did not build, they were there. Understanding them better, whether or not Gunung Padang turns out to be their work, is a worthwhile goal. And the investigation continues. Let me tell you about the paper. In October 2023, the journal Nature published a paper by Danny Hillman Natawijaja and 12 co-authors titled Geo-Archaeological Prospecting of Gunung Padang, Buried Prehistoric Pyramid in West Java, Indonesia. The title was itself a statement, not possible pyramid or proposed pyramid, but buried prehistoric pyramid, presenting the extraordinary interpretation as an established fact rather than a hypothesis. Nature is the most prestigious scientific journal in the world. A paper published in Nature carries an implicit endorsement from the journal's editors and reviewers. An implicit statement that the work meets the rigorous standards of evidence and methodology that the journal demands. When Gunung Padang appeared in Nature, the media response was immediate and global. Headlines around the world announced that the world's oldest pyramid had been discovered. Stories described a buried monument predating all known civilizations by thousands of years. The specific framing that the research team and their supporters had been promoting for more than a decade, Gunung Padang as the key to understanding a lost chapter of human prehistory, received the apparent endorsement of the world's most authoritative scientific journal. Within days, archaeologists, geologists, and geoarchaeologists who had read the paper carefully began to publish critical responses. The criticisms were extensive, specific, and in several cases, devastating. The first major objection was methodological. The paper's argument rested heavily on the interpretation of core samples as showing man-made fills and shaped stones at depth. Critics argued that the paper did not adequately demonstrate that the features identified as man-made were inconsistent with natural geological processes. The descriptions of the cores in the paper were not sufficiently detailed to allow independent evaluation of this claim. The photographs were limited, the petrographic descriptions were incomplete, and the comparison with natural geological processes in similar volcanic environments was inadequate. The second major objection was about the carbon dating. The paper presented carbon dates from organic material in the cores as evidence of construction events at specific depths. Critics argued that the paper had not adequately demonstrated that the dated organic material was associated with construction rather than naturally deposited. The specific argument that organic material at a certain depth was deposited by human builders at that depth requires evidence that the material was incorporated into the construction context rather than infiltrated into it from above or below by natural processes. The paper did not provide this evidence convincingly. The third major objection was about the geophysical interpretation. The paper presented GPR, resistivity and seismic tomography images as showing constructed rooms and passages beneath the surface terraces. Critics argued that the images were consistent with natural geological features, volcanic voids, lava tube complexes, differential weathering of basaltic rock, and that the paper did not adequately demonstrate that the artificial interpretation was preferable to the natural one. A particularly pointed criticism came from the geoarchaeologist Flint Dibble, who published a detailed methodological critique arguing that the paper's use of geophysical evidence was fundamentally flawed. Dibble argued that the paper had committed a basic error in the logic of geophysical interpretation, treating the presence of subsurface anomalies as evidence of construction without adequately ruling out the natural geological explanations for those anomalies. He also criticized the paper's use of photographs and descriptions that were insufficient to allow independent evaluation of the claims. Another group of critics focused on the radiocarbon dating specifically. They argued that the paper had misrepresented the significance of the carbon dates by treating them as dates of construction events when they could only be dates of organic material deposition. A distinction that requires the assumption that the organic material was deposited by human construction, which is precisely what needs to be proven. Nature responded to the flood of criticism relatively quickly. The journal published an editorial note indicating that concerns had been raised about the paper's methods and conclusions, and that the editorial staff were investigating. This is a standard procedure for papers that receive significant post-publication criticism. The journal takes the criticism seriously and initiates its own review. In February 2024, approximately 4 months after publication, Nature retracted the paper. The retraction notice cited concerns about the reliability of the data, the validity of the conclusions, and the adequacy of the peer review process. The retraction was a significant institutional judgment. It meant not just that the paper's conclusions were disputed, scientific disputes are common, but that the paper had failed to meet the standards of evidence and methodology that nature requires. The peer review process, which is supposed to catch exactly these kinds of problems before publication, had failed to do so. The failure of peer review in this case is itself significant and worth examining. How did a paper with these methodological problems make it through the review process at the world's most prestigious scientific journal? The answer is almost certainly a combination of factors. The topic, ancient human prehistory, possible evidence of an ancient civilization, is intrinsically compelling and may have lowered the critical threshold of reviewers who found the narrative exciting. The paper's authors included credentialed researchers from recognized institutions, which lent it apparent authority. The specific technical details of geoarchaeology, The detailed methodology of interpreting core samples and geophysical surveys may have been outside the expertise of the reviewers who were assigned to evaluate it. Peer review is a human process conducted by human scientists with limited time and specific areas of expertise. It catches many errors and prevents many flawed papers from being published, but it does not catch everything, particularly in papers that cross disciplinary boundaries or that address topics where the reviewers may not have the specific regional expertise to evaluate the claims. The retraction of the Gunung Padang paper was a failure of the peer review process as much as a failure of the research. Both failures have things to teach us. The failure of the research teaches us about the specific dangers of over-interpreting ambiguous geophysical and geological evidence in support of a predetermined extraordinary conclusion. The failure of the peer review process teaches us about the limits of the standard journal publication model for evaluating complex multidisciplinary claims. Neither failure means the underlying question is uninteresting or that the evidence at the site is worthless. The retraction removes the extraordinary claim from the published scientific literature. It does not fill the holes that were drilled or erase the geophysical anomalies that were documented. The physical evidence is still there. The question of what it means is still unanswered. And the specific process, careful, independent, rigorously documented investigation of the site that might eventually answer it, has not yet been conducted. The retraction is an ending of one chapter, not of the story. Let me go deeper into the specific critical responses because the critics made important points that deserve more than a summary and that illuminate broader issues about how extraordinary claims should be evaluated. Flint Dibble's critique was perhaps the most technically detailed and the most widely cited. Dibble is a geoarchaeologist, a researcher who specializes in the intersection of geology and archaeology, who studies how geological processes create, modify, and destroy the archaeological record. His expertise is directly relevant to the central methodological dispute in the Gunung Padang paper. Dibble's critique focused on what he called the paper's confirmation bias, the tendency to interpret ambiguous evidence in ways that confirm the extraordinary hypothesis rather than testing it against alternatives. He argued that the paper had presented GPR, resistivity, and seismic images in ways that highlighted the features consistent with the pyramid hypothesis and downplayed the features consistent with natural geological explanations. He showed in his critique that the same raw geophysical data could be interpreted differently, that the anomalies the paper presented as evidence of chambers and rooms could also be interpreted as natural volcanic features. This is a particularly serious criticism because it does not question the quality of the geophysical surveys themselves. It questions the logic of the interpretation. If the same data can support both the extraordinary hypothesis and a conventional geological explanation, then the data does not constitute evidence for the extraordinary hypothesis. Evidence is specific. It is something that is more likely if the hypothesis is true than if it is false. Data that is equally consistent with both is not evidence for either. Dibble also questioned the paper's treatment of the carbon dates. He argued that the paper had implicitly assumed that the dated organic material was associated with construction events, and had used this assumption to present the dates as dates of construction, without adequately testing this assumption against the alternative that the material was naturally deposited. This is a form of circular reasoning, assuming what needs to be proven in order to use the dates as evidence for what you assumed. Another critic, the archaeologist Lutfi Yondri, reiterated his earlier concerns about the interpretation of the core material. Yondri argued that the features identified in the cores as man-made fills were consistent with natural soil formation processes in a volcanic landscape, specifically with the kind of compact angular stone fragment layers that form when columnar basalt weathers and the fragments accumulate in the soil profile. He argued that the paper did not demonstrate that these features were beyond the range of natural geological processes in this specific environment. The specific force of Yondry's criticism derives from his regional expertise. He knows West Javan prehistoric sites. He has excavated them. He has read their stratigraphy. He knows what natural processes in this volcanic landscape produce. When he says the core features are consistent with natural processes, he is speaking from a knowledge base that the geophysicists and tectonic geologists on the research team did not have. This is the specific expertise gap that made the research program vulnerable from the beginning. A team that included experienced Indonesian prehistoric archaeologists alongside the geophysicists and geologists would have been better positioned to distinguish anthropogenic from natural features in the core material, and might have avoided the interpretive errors that the critics identified. Now let me say something about the sociology of how the paper moved from submission to publication to retraction, because this trajectory illuminates something important about how extraordinary claims in science circulate and how the normal mechanisms of quality control sometimes fail. The journey of the Gunung Padang paper through peer review at Nature is not fully transparent. The peer review process at journals is confidential, and the specific concerns of the reviewers who approved the paper for publication have not been made public. But based on the subsequent critical response, it is clear that the reviewers did not adequately identify the central methodological problems that the critics highlighted. Why not? One possibility is that the reviewers did not include a geoarchaeologist with the specific regional expertise to evaluate the interpretation of the core material. Another is that the reviewers found the topic so compelling that their critical threshold was lower than it would have been for a less exciting paper. Another is that the volume and technical complexity of the paper, it is a long, data-rich manuscript, made it difficult for reviewers to evaluate the full range of claims within the time constraints of the review process. Whatever the reason, the failure of peer review to catch the methodological problems before publication allowed the extraordinary claim to receive the imprimatur of the world's most prestigious journal, and thus to receive the global media attention that followed. The harm done by this sequence was twofold. It allowed a flawed paper to circulate as apparently authoritative for several months, and it damaged the credibility of subsequent legitimate research at the site by associating it with a retracted claim. The retraction itself, the institutional correction of the error, is a sign that the self-correcting mechanisms of science eventually worked. But the correction came after the damage was done. The headlines announcing the ancient pyramid had already circulated globally. The retraction received far less media coverage than the original publication. This asymmetry between the reach of extraordinary claims and the reach of their corrections is one of the most persistent problems in the public understanding of science. It applies far beyond archaeology. In medicine, in climate science, in nutrition research, the pattern of exciting claims receiving enormous publicity and their subsequent corrections receiving much less is a structural feature of how science is communicated to the public. The Gunung Padang case is a vivid example of this pattern, and it is a reminder that the first published version of an extraordinary claim, however compelling it seems and however prestigious the journal that published it, should be held lightly until the broader scientific community has had the opportunity to evaluate it. The peer review process is a quality filter. It is not a guarantee. And extraordinary claims, by definition, require extraordinary scrutiny. Let me also engage with the question of what the research team's response to the retraction tells us, because how a scientist responds to the refutation of their work is itself informative. Natawijaya and some of his co-authors responded to the retraction with a statement defending their work. They expressed disagreement with the decision to retract and argued that the critics had not adequately engaged with the full body of evidence they had produced over more than a decade of research. They maintained their core interpretation that Gunung Padang contains a multi-phase buried structure dating to the prehistoric period, and indicated their intention to continue the research and seek publication elsewhere. This response is understandable. Natawijaya has invested more than a decade of his professional life in the investigation of this site. He believes genuinely, and on the basis of evidence he considers compelling, that the site is extraordinary. The retraction of the 2023 paper does not change the evidence he has collected. It changes its published status, not its physical reality. But the response also illustrates one of the specific dangers of deep investment in an extraordinary claim. When a researcher has invested years or decades in a conclusion, the psychological and professional cost of abandoning it is very high. The sunk cost, the time, the fieldwork, the publications, the professional reputation built around the claim, creates a powerful motivation to defend the claim against criticism, rather than to engage with the criticism openly. This is not a moral failing unique to Natawijaya. It is a well-documented feature of human psychology. The sunk cost fallacy, applied to scientific investigation. It affects researchers across all disciplines and at all levels of expertise. The specific discipline of being willing to abandon a cherished hypothesis when the evidence requires it is one of the hardest in science and one of the most important. The history of science is full of researchers who held onto incorrect conclusions long after the evidence should have prompted revision. It is also full of researchers who were right when the consensus was wrong, who maintained their position against criticism because the criticism was inadequate rather than because they were psychologically committed to being right. Distinguishing between these two cases, between the stubborn defender of a wrong theory and the courageous defender of a correct one, requires exactly the kind of careful, independent evaluation of the evidence that has not yet been fully conducted at Gunung Padang. The retraction is not the final verdict on the site. It is a statement about one paper at one moment in the investigation. The investigation should continue, on better terms, with better collaboration, and with the intellectual honesty that extraordinary questions require. Let me give you the honest accounting. After everything we have explored, the site, the geophysical surveys, the core drilling, the carbon dates, the controversy, the retraction, what can we actually say about Gunung Padang with confidence? What is established, what is contested, and what remains genuinely unknown? Let me start with what is not in dispute. Gunung Padang is a real site with a genuine surface megalithic structure. The 5 terraces, the columnar basalt construction, the dry stone walls and pavements. These are real physical features that were built by human hands. They represent a significant achievement of prehistoric construction within the Indonesian megalithic tradition. The site has been occupied and used by the Sundanese people across a long period and continues to be used as a living sacred site today. None of this is disputed by anyone. The conventional dating of the surface terraces, roughly 500 BCE to 1500 CE, is supported by the pottery evidence and the stratigraphic analysis of the visible structure. This dating is not certain. There are gaps in the evidence and some ambiguity about the specific phases of construction, but it is a reasonable interpretation of the available evidence within the conventional archaeological framework. The geophysical surveys, the GPR, resistivity and seismic tomography produced anomalies beneath the surface terraces. These anomalies are real. Multiple independent survey techniques documented them. The anomalies exist and require explanation. The core drilling extracted organic material at depth that was carbon dated to ages significantly older than the surface terraces, ranging from a few thousand years at shallow depths to tens of thousands of years at greater depths. The carbon dates themselves are real. The laboratory results are not in dispute. What is in dispute is what those dates mean. Whether the dated organic material was deposited by human construction activity or by natural geological processes. These are the facts. Now let me be honest about what we do not know. We do not know whether the geophysical anomalies represent constructed features, rooms, passages, chambers, or natural geological features such as volcanic voids, differential weathering zones, or fracture systems. The evidence for either interpretation is, as presented in the published papers, insufficient to conclusively exclude the other. We do not know whether the organic material at depth was deposited by human construction activity or by natural processes. The paper presenting the extraordinary interpretation did not adequately demonstrate that the construction interpretation was correct, and the retraction reflects the scientific community's judgment that the evidence as presented was insufficient. But the retraction does not demonstrate that the natural deposition interpretation is correct either. It simply says that the paper did not prove what it claimed to prove. We do not know whether there is a subsurface structure beneath the surface terraces, and if so, how old it is. The geophysical anomalies are consistent with the possibility of a subsurface structure, but they are also consistent with natural geological features. The core evidence is consistent with both interpretations. Without further, more rigorous investigation, designed specifically to distinguish between these interpretations, the question cannot be resolved. This is the honest state of the evidence, not confirmation of the extraordinary claim, not refutation of it. Genuine uncertainty about questions that the available evidence cannot yet resolve. Now let me assess the strengths and weaknesses of both positions more specifically. The strongest aspect of the Nathawijaya team's case is the consistency of the geophysical anomalies across three independent survey techniques. GPR, resistivity, and seismic tomography are sensitive to different physical properties of the subsurface material, and the fact that all three show anomalies in roughly the same locations provides stronger evidence for the reality of the anomalies than any single technique would. Whatever is causing the anomalies, whether natural or artificial, it is genuinely there. This is a real finding that requires explanation. The second strongest aspect is the carbon dates from the deep cores. These dates are real. The laboratory measurements are not in dispute. If the organic material at depth is genuinely associated with construction activity rather than naturally deposited, the dates would be extraordinary. The problem is the if, but the dates themselves are real data that needs to be accounted for in any adequate interpretation of the site. The weakest aspect of the Nathawijaya team's case is the interpretation of the core material as man-made fills. This interpretation depends on distinguishing anthropogenic from natural fills in a volcanic landscape, a distinction that requires specific regional expertise that the team's primary investigators did not have. The published descriptions of the core material were insufficient to allow independent evaluation of this claim, and the critics with the relevant expertise were not persuaded that the distinction was adequately established. The second weakest aspect is the logical structure of the argument. The extraordinary conclusion that the site is 25,000 years old requires a chain of inferences, each of which introduces uncertainty. The The geophysical anomalies suggest subsurface features. The subsurface features might be constructed. If constructed, the organic material at depth might date the construction. If the organic material dates the construction is 25,000 years old. Each step in this chain adds uncertainty, and the cumulative uncertainty across all steps is very large. Now let me assess the conventional position with equal honesty. The strongest aspect of the conventional position is the absence of comparable sites of similar age anywhere in the world. If a 25,000-year-old constructed structure existed in West Java, it would be by far the oldest known constructed structure on Earth. The absence of comparables is not absolute proof that such a structure cannot exist. Göbekli Tepe had no comparables before it was excavated, but it does mean that the prior probability of the claim is very low, which appropriately raises the evidentiary bar. The second strongest aspect is the adequacy of natural explanations. The geophysical anomalies are consistent with natural geological features. The carbon dates can be explained by natural deposition of organic material. The core features can be explained by natural soil formation processes. None of these alternative explanations requires anything extraordinary. The conventional position is the parsimonious interpretation of the available evidence. The weakest aspect of the conventional position is its dependence on the absence of evidence. The argument that there was no complex society in Southeast Asia at 20,000 BCE is partly an argument from the absence of archaeological evidence for such a society. And that absence is partly a function of the drowned landscape of the Sunda shelf, where the most productive environments of the period are now inaccessible. The second weakest aspect is the inadequate engagement with the geophysical anomalies. The conventional position has not provided a fully detailed geological explanation of why the specific pattern of anomalies documented at Gunung Padang should be expected from natural processes in this specific geological context. Saying that anomalies can have natural explanations is not the same as demonstrating that the specific anomalies at Gunung Padang do have natural explanations. The honest accounting, then, is this. The extraordinary claim is not supported by the evidence as presented. The conventional explanation is plausible, but not fully demonstrated. The site is genuinely unusual and merits further rigorous investigation. The question of whether there is a subsurface structure beneath Gunung Padang, and if so, how old it is, cannot be resolved on the current evidence. That is the honest state of the question. Unsatisfying, perhaps, but honest, and honesty is what the question deserves. Let me think about what a rigorous future investigation of Gunung Padang would need to look like, what specific questions it would need to answer, and what specific methods it would need to use. The central question is whether the geophysical anomalies represent constructed features or natural geological features. Answering this question requires physical investigation of the anomalous zones, drilling or trenching into the areas identified by the geophysical surveys as anomalous, and examining the physical material at those locations. This investigation has been partly conducted. The Natawijaya team drilled cores at several locations. But the drilling was conducted by a team with a stake in the outcome, and the results were interpreted in ways that critics found insufficient. A rigorous investigation would involve cores drilled by a team that includes both geophysicists and experienced geoarchaeologists, with the interpretation of the core material conducted jointly and the results documented with sufficient detail. Photographs, petrographic descriptions, chemical analyses, to allow independent evaluation. The specific features that need to be characterized in the cores are those that distinguish anthropogenic from natural fills. In a volcanic landscape, natural fills are produced by the breakdown of the bedrock. The columnar basalt fragments as it weathers, and the fragments accumulate in the soil profile in characteristic ways. Anthropogenic fills, stone walls and platforms deliberately constructed, have different characteristics. The stones are more regularly arranged, the gaps between them may be filled with deliberately imported materials, and the overall structure has a spatial regularity that natural accumulations lack. Distinguishing these in a core sample is genuinely difficult. A core is a narrow cylinder of material, perhaps 5 or 10 centimeters in diameter, extracted from a specific location. It provides a one-dimensional cross-section through the subsurface, not a three-dimensional view of the spatial structure. Features that are clear in excavation, where you can see the spatial arrangement of stones over a large area, are much harder to characterize in a narrow core. This is why excavation, as well as drilling, may be necessary for a definitive answer. A small, carefully conducted excavation, a trench or a test pit, in one of the anomalous zones identified by the geophysical surveys, would provide a three-dimensional view of the subsurface material that core drilling cannot provide. If that excavation revealed spatially organized stone features inconsistent with natural geological processes, the case for a subsurface structure would be significantly strengthened. The carbon dating program would also need to be redesigned. Rather than dating organic material that happens to be present at depth and interpreting those dates as dates of construction, a properly designed program would specifically target organic material that is demonstrably associated with anthropogenic features. Charcoal within a deliberately constructed hearth, for example, or plant material incorporated into the matrix of a stone fill. This requires prior identification of the anthropogenic features through excavation or detailed core examination. The geophysical surveys would ideally be repeated by an independent team using their own equipment, following the same survey protocols as the original team, and interpreting the results independently before comparing with the original. This independent replication would allow assessment of the reproducibility of the anomalies and would identify any aspects of the original survey that may have been affected by equipment-specific artifacts. Finally, any new investigation would need to include robust consultation with the Sundanese communities whose sacred site this is. Consultation that is genuine and ongoing, not merely formal, and that takes seriously the interest of those communities in how the investigation is conducted and how the results are communicated. This is a significant program of work. It would require sustained funding, international collaboration, institutional goodwill from the Indonesian government, and a level of scientific openness and transparency that has not characterized the investigation to date. It would also require patience. Good archaeology is slow. The specific questions that need to be answered at Gunung Padang cannot be answered in a single field season. They require careful, incremental investigation, each step building on the last, each new piece of evidence evaluated in the context of everything previously found. The rush to publish extraordinary claims before the investigation was complete, the rush that produced the 2023 Nature paper, was antithetical to this kind of careful, patient investigation. The retraction is, in a backhanded way, an opportunity. An opportunity to reset the investigation on better terms, to conduct it properly, to find out what is actually there. Let me also think about what the honest accounting tells us about the specific kind of uncertainty that the Gunung Padang question represents. Because not all uncertainties are the same, and the character of this uncertainty is worth examining. The uncertainty about the age of the Sphinx, which we explored in the previous video, is an uncertainty about the interpretation of physical evidence that is accessible. The weathering of the limestone enclosure walls is there. It can be examined, and the dispute is about how to interpret it. More investigation of the same evidence, conducted more rigorously, could in principle resolve the dispute. The uncertainty about Gunung Padang has a similar character, but is compounded by a specific additional problem. The key evidence, the subsurface features and the organic material at depth, is not fully accessible. It was sampled by the research team and interpreted in one specific way, and that interpretation was published and then retracted. But the physical material in the cores may still exist, and the anomalous zones identified by the geophysical surveys certainly still exist in the hill. The evidence is there. It has not been destroyed. It has not even been fully examined. What is missing is the investigation that would examine it properly, with the right expertise, the right methods, the right collaborative structure, and the right institutional support. This is a different kind of uncertainty from the permanent uncertainty of, say, the Voynich manuscript, where the text exists but may be literally undecipherable. The Gunung Padang uncertainty is resolvable in principle. There is a fact of the matter about whether a subsurface structure exists and how old it is, and there are physical methods that could determine this fact. The resolution is possible. It requires will, the institutional and political will to conduct a rigorous, independent investigation of a site that has been the center of a polarizing controversy. Will is harder to generate than methods, but it is not impossible. And the site will wait. Let me place Gunung Padang alongside the other sites we have been exploring across this series. Over the course of these videos, we have visited a number of sites and a number of questions that sit at the boundary of what the conventional archaeological timeline can accommodate. The Great Sphinx of Giza, with its water erosion patterns that some geologists argue imply an age significantly greater than the conventional 2500 BCE. The megalithic stone circles of Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, built by hunter-gatherers at approximately 10,000 BCE, before agriculture, before cities, before the conventional model predicted that monumental construction was possible. The astronomical stone circles of Nabta Playa in the Egyptian Sahara, built by the cattle herders of the African humid period at approximately 5,000 to 6,000 BCE, demonstrating that the people of the pre-dynastic Sahara were tracking the stars and building aligned monuments. And now, Gunung Padang in West Java, a site where a team of researchers has claimed, controversially, and with the claim now retracted, to have found evidence of construction extending back to 25,000 BCE. These sites are not all equivalent. Göbekli Tepe is established fact. Its dating is secure, its construction is not in dispute. Its existence has transformed the conventional model of prehistoric human capability. Nabta Playa is similarly well established, a documented example of pre-dynastic astronomical and megalithic activity in the African Sahara. The Sphinx water erosion debate is genuinely contested, with substantial evidence on both sides and no definitive resolution. Gunung Padang is the most problematic, the most extraordinary claim, the weakest evidentiary support, the most serious methodological concerns. But even taking these differences seriously, the accumulation of sites represents something worth reflecting on. It represents a pattern. The pattern is this. Repeatedly across the last 3 decades of archaeological and geological research, evidence has emerged from various parts of the world suggesting that the conventional timeline of human civilizational development, the timeline that places complex, organized, symbolically sophisticated human activity after the agricultural revolution of 10,000 BCE, may be incomplete. Not wrong in its outlines, not requiring the kind of dramatic revision that the lost civilization narratives propose, but incomplete in a specific and important way. The incompleteness is about the capabilities of pre-agricultural and early agricultural human societies. The conventional model assumed that mobile hunter-gatherers were incapable of the sustained, organized, collective labor that monumental construction requires. Göbekli Tepe demonstrated that this assumption was wrong. The convention then adjusted. Perhaps hunter-gatherers at the very edge of the transition to agriculture, in specific regions with specific resource conditions, could do what Göbekli Tepe required. But the broader model of hunter-gatherer incapacity for monumental construction remained. Each new anomalous site represents a potential further challenge to the adjusted model. The Sphinx water erosion, if Schoch is right, pushes the frontier of organized construction in the Nile Valley back by several thousand years beyond even the conventional Old Kingdom date. Gunung Padang, if the most extraordinary dating claims were correct, would push the frontier of organized construction in Southeast Asia back by 15,000 years beyond Göbekli Tepe. The cumulative effect of these challenges, even where the specific claims remain contested, is to shift the intellectual landscape of the debate. 10 years ago, the idea that significant organized construction might have occurred before 10,000 BCE was considered so implausible as to be barely worth discussing. Today, after Göbekli Tepe and the re-examination of the Sphinx, and the investigation of Nabta Playa and the Gunung Padang controversy, the question of what the pre-agricultural world was capable of is genuinely open in a way it was not before. This is not a vindication of the lost civilization narratives. It is not evidence that an advanced technological civilization existed before the flood and was wiped out by some catastrophe. The specific claims of the popular alternative history tradition, the Atlantis narratives, the ancient aliens theories, are not supported by any of the evidence we have been discussing. What the evidence does support is a more modest but still significant revision, that the conventional model has underestimated the organizational and cultural complexity of pre-agricultural human societies, and that the boundary between the meaningful and the irrelevant human past may need to be pushed back further than the conventional timeline acknowledges. This is genuinely interesting. It is interesting in the specific way that good history is interesting. Not because it confirms a dramatic narrative, but because it complicates a simple one, because it reveals that the world was more varied and more surprising than a tidy model predicted. Let me now think about what the specific pattern of the anomalous sites tells us about the geography of pre-agricultural human complexity. Göbekli Tepe is in southeastern Turkey. In the northern Fertile Crescent, the region where agriculture itself first emerged. This is perhaps not surprising. If any region of the world was going to produce the first examples of complex, organized construction before the agricultural revolution. The region that was on the cusp of that revolution seems like a plausible candidate. Nabta Playa is in the Egyptian Sahara, a region that was productive and relatively densely populated during the African humid period, and that became uninhabitable as the climate shifted to aridity after approximately 5000 BCE. The astronomical stone circles of Nabta Playa represent the activity of a people who were living in a temporary window of abundance that the climate provided and then withdrew. The Sphinx is at Giza, on the edge of the Nile Valley, the region that became the heart of Egyptian civilization. If an earlier phase of complex human activity existed in this region before the dynastic period, it would have been in the context of the African humid period, when the surrounding Sahara was productive and the Nile Valley itself was more abundantly watered. Gunung Padang is in West Java. In the Sunda Shelf region, the connected landmass of Southeast Asia that was dramatically different at the last glacial maximum, with large areas of what is now shallow sea exposed as dry land. The site sits at the edge of this former landmass, on a hill that was accessible from the lowlands of the Sunda shelf. What these geographic locations have in common is that they are all, in different ways, at the edges of the major environmental transitions of the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. The end of the African humid period, the end of the last glacial maximum, the beginning of the agricultural transition. They are sites at the boundaries of the major transformations that shaped the human world. This is suggestive rather than conclusive. There is a bias toward finding sites at environmental boundaries because these are the places where human populations were concentrated and where the archaeological traces of human activity are most likely to be preserved. But the pattern is worth noting. The deep human past may be more concentrated at these environmental boundaries than the conventional model assumed. And the investigation of those boundaries, the edges of the ice ages, the margins of the humid periods, the coastal lowlands now drowned by rising seas, may reveal a human world more complex and more surprising than the simple story of agriculture as the beginning of everything. Gunung Padang is part of this larger investigation. However, its specific claims are ultimately evaluated. The controversy it generated has drawn attention to the deep prehistory of Southeast Asia, to the Sunda shelf landscape, to the capabilities of the people who lived there at the last glacial maximum, to the specific questions that the drowned landscape makes hard to answer. These are real questions. They matter. And they will be answered gradually by the patient accumulation of evidence from the sites that have survived above the waterline and from the drowned landscapes that technology will eventually make accessible. The world before the flood is still there. We are only beginning to look for it properly. Let me develop the specific theme of environmental boundaries more fully, because I think it is one of the most productive ways to think about the accumulation of anomalous sites, and about why the deep human past looks increasingly complex the more carefully we look at it. The end of the last glacial maximum, the period between roughly 19,000 and 11,000 years ago, was one of the most dramatic environmental transitions in the recent geological record. The ice sheets retreated. Sea levels rose over the course of 10,000 years by approximately 120 meters globally. The coastlines of every continent changed shape. The Sunda shelf was flooded. The Sahel shelf, connecting Australia to New Guinea, was flooded. The Bering Land Bridge, through which the first Americans had crossed from Siberia, was flooded. These flooding events were not instantaneous. They occurred over millennia, with periods of faster and slower sea level rise, depending on the rate of ice sheet melting. The specific timing and speed of inundation varied by region and by the specific geometry of each coastline. During the periods of flooding, the people who had been living on the coastal lowlands were displaced. The productive environments, the coastal plains, the estuaries, the shallow water fishing grounds that had supported large human populations were drowned. The people moved to higher ground. When populations are displaced from productive environments into less productive ones, they face a choice: adapt or decline. Some populations declined, their numbers fell, their social complexity reduced, their material culture simplified, as the resources that had sustained them were removed. Others adapted, finding new resource bases, developing new technologies, reorganizing their social structures to fit the changed conditions. The people who adapted and survived carried with them the accumulated knowledge and cultural traditions of the environments they had left. They brought their skills, their social organization, their understanding of the natural world, their ritual traditions, their ways of making meaning. They also brought their memory of the places they had left. The drowned coastlines of the post-glacial world are, in many cultures, preserved in oral tradition as memory of a time when the sea was further away. when the land was more extensive, when people lived in places that are now underwater. These traditions are found in Australian Aboriginal cultures, in the coastal traditions of South Asia, in the myths of Southeast Asian maritime peoples. Whether these traditions preserve specific factual memories of pre-flooding landscapes, or whether they represent a more general mythological response to the evidence of drowned lands visible in shallow coastal waters, is a question that researchers are beginning to take seriously. The Sunda Shelf region, the drowned landmass of Southeast Asia, is one of the most significant drowned landscapes in the world in terms of its former human significance. At the last glacial maximum, this was a vast, connected, presumably productive lowland landscape that supported large human populations across a wide area. The people of the Sunda Shelf had tens of thousands of years of cultural development in an environment that is now entirely inaccessible. Gunung Padang sits at the edge of this former landscape, on a hill that was above the flooding but surrounded by the former lowlands that are now the Java Sea. If the hill was significant to the people of the Sunda Shelf lowlands at the last glacial maximum, if it was a landmark, a sacred site, a place of gathering, the memory of that significance might have persisted through the flooding, through the population displacement, through the centuries and millennia of adaptation to changed conditions. The Sundanese tradition that surrounds Gunung Padang today, the keramat, the sacredness, the connection to the mythological past, might be the attenuated but genuine remnant of a very much older tradition. Not a tradition that remembers the specific events of 20,000 BCE with factual accuracy, but a tradition that preserves in mythologized form the sense that this specific place has always mattered, that it was significant to the people who were here before, and their memory of its significance was transmitted, changed and transformed across millennia to the people who are here now. This is speculative, but it is grounded speculation, connected to real patterns in the archaeology of drowned landscapes, in the anthropology of oral tradition, in the environmental history of Southeast Asia. The Gunung Padang debate is not just about whether a particular hill in West Java is 25,000 years old. It is about whether we are looking at the deep human past in the right places, with the right tools. And the accumulation of sites, Göbekli Tepe, Nabta Playa, the Sphinx, Gunung Padang, suggests that the answer to that question may be no. We have been looking primarily at the dry land. Most of the pre-glacial human world is under the sea. Let me close this part with a reflection on what the emerging picture, this accumulation of sites and questions and partial revisions of the conventional timeline, means for the broader project of understanding the human past. The conventional narrative of human history is a narrative of progress, from simple to complex, from primitive to sophisticated, from mobile to settled. It places the meaningful human story in the last 10,000 years and treats everything before as prologue. This narrative is comforting in a specific way. It gives us a clear beginning, a clear direction, and a sense that the current moment is the culmination of a long trajectory of improvement. The accumulation of anomalous sites challenges this narrative, not by replacing it with an alternative grand narrative, not by substituting the lost civilization story for the conventional story, but by revealing that the conventional story is simpler than reality. The human past was not a single linear trajectory from simple to complex. It was a more varied, more textured, more surprising story, full of dead ends and unexpected flourishings and capabilities that emerged and were lost, and emerged again in different forms. Göbekli Tepe represents a flourishing that ended without a clear descendant tradition. The builders of Göbekli Tepe did not go on to build cities and develop writing. They built their circles and buried them, and eventually became part of the broader agricultural revolution. And their specific tradition was absorbed into that larger transformation. The people of the African humid period Sahara represented another flourishing: the Tassili painters, the Nabta Playa astronomers, the cattle herders of a world that was green and productive. When the Sahara dried, they moved to the Nile Valley and contributed their knowledge and their traditions to what became Egyptian civilization. If there were complex human communities in the Sunda Shelf lowlands at the last glacial maximum, they too represented a specific flourishing, adapted to a specific environment, capable of specific things, part of a specific cultural tradition. When the sea rose and the lowlands were drowned, they moved to higher ground and contributed whatever they had to the communities they joined. The history of the deep human past is a history of lost worlds, worlds that flourished in specific environmental conditions and were transformed or ended when those conditions changed. Gunung Padang may or may not be a monument of one of those lost worlds. But the question it raises about what the people of the Sunda Shelf were doing and what they were capable of before the sea rose is a genuine and important question. And the answer to that question is somewhere under the water, waiting for the technology that will make it accessible, waiting for the will to look. Let me ask the philosophical question directly. What would it actually mean if a 20,000-year-old constructed structure were confirmed, not claimed, not retracted, but confirmed by rigorous, independent, reproducible investigation that met the standards of evidence that science requires? Not what it would mean for the popular media narrative, not what it would mean for the lost civilization industry, what it would mean for our actual understanding of ourselves, of what kind of beings we are, how long we have been doing the things that define us, and what the relationship is between the deep human past and the world we inhabit today. Let me start with what it would require us to believe. A confirmed 20,000-year-old constructed structure at Gunung Padang would require us to believe that organized, sustained, large-scale collective labor was possible for human communities at the last glacial maximum, 15,000 years before Göbekli Tepe, 20,000 years before the agricultural revolution. It would require us to believe that the specific organizational and economic conditions that such construction requires, the ability to concentrate a workforce, to feed them, to direct their labor toward a specific goal over an extended period, existed in Southeast Asia at 20,000 BCE. This would not necessarily require believing that these communities had writing, or cities, or metallurgy, or any of the other capabilities that we associate with complex civilization. It would require believing that they had developed, in the specific ecological context of the Sunda Shelf lowlands, a level of social organization and economic surplus that the conventional model does not credit to communities of this period. The specific conditions of the Sunda Shelf at the last glacial maximum, a vast, connected, biologically productive tropical and subtropical lowland landscape, might have been capable of supporting larger and more complex human communities than the conventional model predicts. The conventional model is calibrated primarily to the conditions of the temperate and sub-Arctic environments where most of the well-studied last glacial maximum archaeological sites are located. It may not accurately characterize the potential of tropical and subtropical coastal lowland environments. If the Sunda Shelf lowlands were capable of supporting communities comparable in complexity to the early Holocene societies of the Fertile Crescent, communities large enough and organized enough to undertake modest monumental construction, then the existence of a 20,000-year-old structure in the region would be surprising but not impossible. It would require revising the conventional model for this specific environmental context, not for all environments everywhere. This is a much more modest revision than the popular alternative history narrative would suggest. It does not imply a global advanced civilization. It implies a locally specific development of social complexity in a specific and particularly favorable environment. A development that was ended or transformed by the flooding of the Sunda shelf as sea levels rose. Now let me think about what such a finding would mean for the broader project of understanding human nature. One of the deepest questions in the study of human prehistory is the question of when the specifically human capacities, the symbolic thought, the ritual behavior, the capacity for collective meaning-making that distinguishes Homo sapiens from all other species, first emerged, and what they looked like in their earliest forms. The conventional answer places these capacities at the origin of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, roughly 300,000 years ago, with their full behavioral expression perhaps 100,000 to 50,000 years ago, during what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. The cave paintings of southern France and the personal ornaments of early modern humans in Africa and the Middle East are evidence of symbolic thought operating at full human capacity. But the connection between symbolic capacity and organized collective action, between the ability to think symbolically and the ability to translate that thought into large-scale physical construction, is not simple. Symbolic thought is a cognitive capacity. Organized collective action is a social and economic capacity. Both are necessary for monumental construction, but they are not the same thing, and they do not necessarily develop together. The specific threshold between simple and complex social organization, the threshold at which communities become capable of the sustained collective labor that monumental construction requires, is one of the most interesting and most contested questions in prehistoric anthropology. Göbekli Tepe pushed this threshold back to at least 10,000 BCE. If Gunung Padang's most extraordinary dating were confirmed, it would push the threshold back to at least 20,000 BCE. What this would tell us is that the specifically human capacity for organized collective action at scale, the capacity that builds temples and pyramids and cathedrals and cities, is older and more fundamental than the conventional model credits. It would suggest that this capacity does not require agriculture, does not require writing, does not require metallurgy, or any of the other specific technologies that the conventional narrative associates with civilization. It requires only the right ecological conditions and the right social traditions. This is a profound implication. It suggests that civilization, understood not as writing and cities and states, but as the organized, intentional, collective transformation of the environment in accordance with shared meaning, is a capacity that has been latent in our species for much longer than we thought. That it emerges whenever the conditions are right, that it has probably emerged, flourished, and been extinguished multiple times in the deep past, in places and at times that the conventional archaeological record has not reached. The lost civilizations of the popular imagination are not the right model for what this would mean. The right model is something more modest but more profound, a recognition that the human capacity for complex collective action is older than agriculture, older than the conventional timeline of civilization, woven into our nature at a level that predates the specific historical circumstances that produced the civilizations we know. We are a species that has been building things together for a very long time, perhaps much longer than we thought, perhaps in places that are now under the sea. This is what a confirmed Gunung Padang would mean. Not a lost civilization with advanced technology. Not aliens, not Atlantis. Something both more modest and more profound, evidence that the human impulse to organize, to build, to make meaning out of stone, is ancient beyond the reach of the conventional archaeological record. ancient in the way that language is ancient and art is ancient, and the capacity for love and grief and wonder is ancient. Ancient because it is us, not something we invented when conditions allowed, something we always were. The conditions at Gunung Padang, whatever they were whenever the site was built, allowed it to emerge there and then. The conditions in your life allow it to emerge here and now. That is the specific thread that connects a disputed hill in West Java to the person lying in the dark tonight. The same impulse, the same species, across whatever the distance is. Let me develop this philosophical point more carefully, because it touches on something fundamental about the relationship between the human past and the human present. The conventional story of human history tends to treat civilization as something that happened to us, something that emerged from specific historical circumstances and that could, in principle, not have happened, or have happened differently, or have been delayed or accelerated. In this story, we are lucky to have agriculture and cities and writing, because without those specific developments, we would still be hunter-gatherers, capable of symbolic thought, but not of the organized collective action that civilization requires. The alternative implied by the accumulation of anomalous sites, by Göbekli Tepe and Nabta Playa and the Sphinx, and possibly Gunung Padang, is subtly but importantly different. In this alternative, the capacity for organized collective action at scale is not something that happened to us. It is something we are. It is a feature of what Homo sapiens is. A species capable of complex social organization, of sustained collective intention, of the transformation of environments in accordance with shared meaning. In this alternative, civilization, in the broad sense of organized, intentional, collective life, did not begin with agriculture. It has been emerging and re-emerging in different forms and at different scales, wherever the ecological and social conditions allowed, throughout the entire span of our species' existence. Agriculture provided the specific conditions that made civilization persistent and scalable, that allowed it to grow and accumulate and eventually produce the world we live in. But the underlying capacity, the capacity to organize, to build, to make meaning together, was already there. This is a more generous picture of our species than the conventional narrative allows. It suggests that the humans of 20,000 BCE were not simply waiting for agriculture to make them capable of something important. They were already doing important things, things that the conventional archaeological record, biased toward the dry land above the sea level of the period, has not been able to see. The drowned worlds are important here, not just as potential repositories of archaeological evidence, but as a reminder of the limits of our knowledge. We have been reconstructing the human past from a sample that is systematically biased toward the environments that have survived the sea level rise of the last 12,000 years, biased toward the materials that preserve well in those environments, biased toward the questions that the surviving evidence can answer. The sample bias does not invalidate what we have learned. It contextualizes it. The conventional timeline of civilization is the history of the parts of the human past that the surviving evidence can tell us about. It is not and cannot be the history of the human past as it actually was. The actual human past was larger, more varied, more surprising than the surviving evidence shows. We are beginning to glimpse this through the cave paintings and the astronomical alignments and the megalithic circles and the contested cores from a hill in West Java. The glimpses are partial, they are tantalizingly incomplete, but they are real glimpses of a world that existed, of people who built things and believed things and organized their lives around meanings that we can barely reconstruct. And they are people, fully, completely, recognizably people, looking up at the same stars, building on the same hills, finding meaning in the same impulse to shape stone and space and time into something that outlasts the individual life. That impulse is still here, in this room, in this darkness, in whatever you are building, whatever you are making, whatever meaning you are trying to create. The thread is unbroken. Even the parts of it we have lost are somehow still part of the thread. Let me also think about what the Gunung Padang debate tells us about the relationship between science and human meaning, between the empirical investigation of the past and the need to find the past meaningful. The Gunung Padang controversy attracted the intensity it did, partly because the stakes felt high, not just scientifically, but existentially. The possibility that a 25,000-year-old structure might exist in West Java is not just an interesting archaeological datum. It is a claim about who we are and how long we have been who we are. It is a claim about the depth of the human story. The depth of the human story matters to people in a way that is not simply about intellectual curiosity. It matters because the depth gives meaning to the present. If human beings have been building, creating, organizing, making meaning for 20,000 years, or 30,000 years, or 50,000 years, if the capacity for civilized life in the broad sense is not a recent invention, but an ancient property of our species, then the specific civilization we live in now is not a fragile novelty sitting atop a long, dark prehistory. It is the current expression of something very old and very deep. This is comforting in a specific and important way. It suggests that the capacity for complex collective life, the capacity that produces science and art and philosophy, and the specific kind of understanding you are engaging in right now, listening to this in the dark, is not contingent on the specific historical circumstances of the agricultural revolution. It is intrinsic. It would have found expression eventually in whatever historical circumstances obtained. The lost worlds under the sea do not diminish this. They enrich it. They suggest that the human story has been going on for longer than we knew, in more places than we knew, in forms we have not yet discovered. The investigation of those lost worlds, the underwater archaeology, the analysis of anomalous sites, the patient accumulation of evidence from the boundaries of the ice ages and the edges of the drowned continents, is one of the most important intellectual projects of the coming century. Gunung Padang is part of that project, controversially, imperfectly, with methods that were found wanting and claims that were retracted. But part of it, the question it raised, what were people doing in Southeast Asia at the last glacial maximum, and what were they capable of, is a real question. It deserves a real answer. And the answer is somewhere in the drowned landscape of the Sunda shelf, waiting for the people who will eventually go looking for it. Let the night settle over the hill. The mist that filled the valleys when we began this journey is still there. It moves slowly in the darkness, thickening in the low places, thinning where the volcanic slopes rise above it. The tea plantations and rice paddies of the Cianjur Regency are invisible in the dark, their geometry lost under the mist and the starlight. The volcanic peaks stand against the sky in every direction, their outlines darker than the dark sky behind them. And on the hill, the stones are still. The columnar basalt of the terraces, grey-black and ancient, fitted together in dry stone construction that may be 1,000 years old, or 2,000, or something that cannot yet be determined. The offerings left by the last pilgrims have settled into the stillness of the late night, the flowers losing their colour in the dark, the incense long since finished. The stone pavement of the upper terrace is cool and damp with the mist. Beneath the terraces, the question persists. Whatever is down there, constructed rooms or natural voids, the work of ancient hands or the work of ancient geological processes, it is down there right now, in the dark, in the subsurface of the volcanic hill, as it has been for however long it has been there. The drilling that sampled it has been done. The geophysical surveys that imaged it have been conducted. The papers that described it have been written and published and retracted. The controversy that surrounded it has burned through its most intense phase. And the thing itself, the rock, the soil, the anomalies, remains. Uninterpreted, or rather, interpreted and disputed and retracted and still unresolved. Still waiting for the investigation that would settle what it is. Let me try to describe what it feels like to have spent this night at Gunung Padang, to have moved through the geology and the controversy and the philosophy and arrived here, at the end in the dark on the hill. There is a specific quality to engaging with a question that is genuinely uncertain. Not uncertain because we haven't looked hard enough, but uncertain because the evidence we have is insufficient to resolve it, and the evidence we need is in places we haven't yet been able to reach. It is different from the comfortable uncertainty of a puzzle that you know has a solution and are working toward. It is the more demanding uncertainty of a question where the answer might not be findable with the tools we currently have. The Gunung Padang debate represents this kind of demanding uncertainty. The question of whether there is a 25,000-year-old structure beneath the terraces is not answerable with the evidence currently available. The investigation that has been conducted was flawed. The investigation that would settle the question has not been conducted. And the conditions, political, institutional, financial, that would allow that investigation to be conducted rigorously are not yet in place. This is uncomfortable in the specific way that genuine intellectual honesty is uncomfortable. We want answers. We want to know. The feeling of an unresolved question, particularly one as large and as charged as the deep prehistory of human civilization, is a feeling of incompleteness that the human mind resists. But the discomfort is worth sitting with. It is more honest than the false certainty of either the enthusiastic endorsement or the dismissive skepticism. It is the specific discomfort of taking the evidence seriously enough to be affected by its ambiguity, of caring enough about the truth to remain genuinely uncertain when the evidence does not yet permit certainty. That quality of caring, of taking ancient questions seriously enough to remain uncertain about them, is one of the most specifically human qualities. The cave painters of Lascaux took the world seriously enough to paint it. The builders of Göbekli Tepe took their rituals seriously enough to carve stone for them. The cattle herders of the African humid period took the movements of the stars seriously enough to build circles aligned to them. And we, right now, in whatever hour of the night this is for you, are taking the question of what people built in West Java 20,000 years ago seriously enough to lie in the dark and think about it. This seriousness is not nothing. It is a specific form of respect for the past, for the people who were there before us, who looked up at the same stars and worked in the same stone and organized their lives around meanings we can barely reconstruct. We owe them the respect of taking their world seriously, even when the evidence is insufficient to tell us exactly what that world was. Let everything settle now. Let the mist fill the valleys of West Java. Let the terraces of Gunung Padang rest in the dark. Let the columnar basalt hold its silence. Whatever it knows, whatever secrets the subsurface contains, whatever the truth is about the age of this hill and the intentions of the people who first worked it, let the question rest without urgency. The question is real. The evidence is real. The investigation that would answer it will happen, eventually, in the conditions that make good science possible. It may take years. It may take decades. It may require the development of technology that does not yet exist. Technology that can sample subsurface material with sufficient resolution and sufficient documentation to settle the interpretation question once and for all. Until then, the hill waits. In the way that volcanic hills in West Java wait, patiently in geological time, indifferent to the controversy that human beings have generated around them, unchanged by the papers published about them or retracted from them. The stones do not know they are contested. They are simply there, as they have been since before anyone thought to ask about them, as they will be long after the question is answered. Let yourself settle too, into the specific peace of having engaged seriously with a difficult question and having arrived at an honest uncertainty rather than a false resolution. That honest uncertainty is worth something. It is a more accurate relationship with the available evidence than either enthusiasm or dismissal would provide. The mist is still in the valleys. The stars are out above the volcanic peaks. The pilgrims have gone home, back down the 400 steps, back to the villages in the lowlands. The site is quiet now. The terraces are empty. The question is still there, but quietly, in the dark. The way questions rest when you have held them carefully, and then, because the night is long and the body needs to sleep, you set them down gently. They will be there when you return. The hill will be there, the mist, the stones. The slow, ongoing investigation of what human beings have always been and how far back that story actually goes. It has been going on for a long time. It will continue. Sleep well. But stay with it a moment longer. There is something specific about this particular question, the question of Gunung Padang, that makes it particularly suited to the small hours of the night. It is a question about what happened a very long time ago in a place most people have never visited, about which the evidence is ambiguous and the investigation is incomplete, and the verdict is not yet in. It is exactly the kind of question that the daytime world does not have room for. The daytime world has its urgencies, its tasks, its decisions, its immediate demands. The daytime world is not patient with unresolved questions that may not be resolved for decades. It wants answers, or at least the appearance of answers. The specific quality of sitting with genuine uncertainty, of being present with the not knowing without rushing toward a premature resolution, is a quality that the night permits and the day often does not. This is one of the gifts of the sleep hour. Not sleep itself, not unconsciousness, but the liminal quality of the time before sleep, when the day's urgencies have receded and the mind can range more freely, can move through questions without the pressure to resolve them, can sit with the complexity and the uncertainty of things that genuinely require complexity and uncertainty. Gunung Padang is one of those things. It is a question that deserves the quality of attention that the night allows. Not the sharp, outcome-focused attention of the working day. The slower, more patient attention of the late hour, when the mind can hold a question without pressing it for an answer. The hill in West Java is a specific physical place. The terraces and the stones and the mist in the valleys are real, not abstract. But the question the hill carries is larger than the hill. It is a question about the depth of the human story, about how far back the specifically human qualities, the impulse to build, to organize, to make meaning in stone, extend, about what we are and how long we have been it. These are questions that the human mind has been asking for as long as there have been minds to ask them. Every generation that has stood before an ancient monument, before Stonehenge, before the pyramids, before the cave paintings of Lascaux, has asked some version of the same question. Who made this, and when, and why? And what does it tell us about ourselves? Gunung Padang is the current version of that question. Contested, uncertain, imperfectly investigated, but genuinely asking something important about the depth and the nature of the human capacity for civilized life. The investigation will continue. The answer will come, eventually. And when it does, it will almost certainly be more complicated and more interesting than either the most enthusiastic or the most skeptical version of the current debate suggests. That is the nature of answers to genuinely important questions. They always are. Sleep well.